Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the third part of What If Deku Became Shigaraki's Obsession? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The dawn of the next weekday morning began with Midoriya peeking into Todoroki's apartment space and bedroom just before his alarm was supposed to go off. He found him sleeping completely still with an unnatural lump under his shirt, though he knew what it was when he saw a paw with delicate toe beans poking out from underneath. "Shuto," he hummed, going closer to the bed and sitting down beside him. He placed his hand on the sleeping teenager's forehead and tried to lightly shake him awake. "We have school today," he reminded. Yet the only response was some tired grumbling. Perhaps hero school wasn't so appealing to someone who didn't believe in heroes that much anymore. Though the knowledge that he would likely have to return to the mansion that afternoon was not that appealing either. As punishment for not awakening to Midoriya's soft nudges, Todoroki was greeted with a blaring alarm from his phone that was much more annoying and displeasing. He growled as grumpy narrowed eyes opened and he hastily reached for his phone to shut off. He looked pissed to be alive. In an attempt to soothe that anger, the little villain leaned down to kiss his forehead. "Good morning, Shuto," he smiled. And then Zuzu wiggled up his shirt and gave him a few kisses to his face too. At least he woke up surrounded by love. Kurojiiri delivered breakfast secretly once again and gave the two plenty of time to prepare themselves for the day. Midoriya had Todoroki close his eyes and step into a portal to take them just down the road from their school, and as they walked together, Todoroki felt his phone vibrate. He received a text from an unidentified number. "Unknown. I will bring your dog home safely this afternoon as well as your things. Text this number if you ever require Izuku's or my services again. Izuku's caretaker." He looked at his phone curiously, wondering if Midoriya gave his dad his phone number or if had he gotten it secretly. He could ask, and yet he didn't. Instead, he added the number to his contacts as Izuku's dad, and somehow he felt more secure with this number than he did with just his own father's. He'd be sure to use it for emergencies only as he didn't want to impose. Whoever was in this family had done so much for him, more than anyone has done in such a long time. "Your dad must be really nice," he commented plainly, putting his phone back in his pocket. Midoriya smiled and scratched his cheek with his index finger. "He totally is. He's awesome." Upon entering, Midoriya could tell Todoroki was not happy to be at school. His eyes looked like they had on the first day, cold, distant, isolated, and bitter. Midoriya wanted him to get his feelings out the night before, letting him get a taste of emotional freedom. But he felt bad for bringing it out so much that it was lingering like this. So before they parted, he got on his toes to grant him a quick kiss on the cheek. "Have a good day today, okay? I'll see you at lunch," he smiled sweetly. "We could even sneak outside to eat instead. Does that sound good?" He could tell that Todoroki didn't want to be near people, to be near heroes and hero wannabes. "Yeah, that sounds nice," he agreed. It was all perfect timing. Midoriya sat down in his homeroom class to find a piece of paper on his desk to be filled out. Their newly elected class president was setting them down for everyone to fill out individually. They were sign-ups for the annual sports festival. Because they were in a general studies course, those that were interested in the hero program would be able to sign up and give it a shot. Others could back out and watch with an extra assignment in hand. It only took one glance for the little villain to mark off the "not interested" box. He didn't want any part of this festival when it was more like a dogfighting ring. Imagining Todoroki taking part in it pissed him off. All those people watching him and only appreciating him for his quirk, bidding on him to join their agencies, encouraging him to mindlessly fight his classmates for a chance at a better social status in hero society, it was disgusting to think about. As he turned in his form to the class president, he peeked back at Shinso sitting alone at his desk. He was hunched over the paper with his hand in his hair, seeming a bit stressed out in silence. Midoriya nearly pitied him. He could only wonder what his backstory was and how it brought him here, clawing desperately for acceptance. Trying so hard to be a hero even though nobody trusted him. Why not just give up? After general classes, all the students were brought to the observation room as usual. Midoriya watched Todoroki struggle with his frustrations. His ice was more jagged than usual. There was more excess frost than normal. His breathing was not rhythmic and his precision was off. He had so much on his mind, but he wasn't allowed to let those feelings out at school. They would always hold him back if he went into the hero field. They would never let him express what he was really feeling and always tell him to hold his power back and hold his tongue. Shigaraki would never allow for such a thing. The path to villainy was neatly paving its way for him at this point. It would be tempting, irresistible even. His attention was pried away by the sight of Yamada and Shinso conversing beside him. Shinso still had his form in his hands and had almost filled it out to participate in the sports festival, and the teacher was leaning over his shoulder with a kind smile, as supportive and caring as ever. "What if everyone just gets more scared of me?" the tired boy asked quietly. "You never know if you don't try. Maybe a pro will see something like I do in you and ask to be your mentor. It could open up so many great possibilities for you." He was just getting his hopes up naively. Midoriya could only pity him. Quirks don't define you as good or bad, it's your choices and intentions. Watching you, I know you want nothing more than good for people. So, Yamada shook him a bit with a hand on his shoulder, encouraging the boy to take a chance to be something he's wanted to be. And yet he still seemed unsure, yet comforted. "I think you should." Midoriya wasn't thinking when he spoke. Something just slipped out as he was staring down at his notebook that was opened to a page of Todoroki. What a world it would be if he had never succumbed to villainy. Would they have become heroes together? "You can be a hero," he smiled, but a tear fell from one eye onto the paper. If someone could have just told him that. Both Yamada and Shinso turned to Midoriya and didn't see his tear from their angle but heard the smallest quake in his voice to know what he was really feeling. But hearing the little villain so pained, Shinso nodded and finished filling out the paper, much to Yamada's pride in him. Midoriya watched the form get handed off. Surely their teacher would just slip it in with the rest. Try to smile a bit more. Confidence in yourself is key to strength, Yamada said with a little nudge to the purple-haired student. And there's lots to smile for when people believe in you, and with that bit of advice, a half smile rose from the student, though it did look a bit scary. He was just doing his best. Midoriya also smiled softly hearing what was said, turning to the page in his notebook that had a sketch and a few notes on Shigaraki. His art skills have gotten much more impressive despite clear eraser marks around the face of his sketch. He was sure to have him drawn with a slight smile. When people believe in you, huh? Midoriya was sure to greet Todoroki with a bright smile after they met near the cafeteria exit. Both of them had taken food and put them in little boxes with chopsticks and snuck out of the school to spend time in the field around the building. There was a line of trees and bushes that were planted for decoration and a gap in the center, so it was the center that they decided to sit down. It was much quieter there than it was inside, and Todoroki appeared far more relaxed this way, comfortable with just them. He soon laid down with his head on Midoriya's thigh as they peacefully ate. "Hey, Shudo," Midoriya began after chewing and swallowing a piece of sushi. The other tilted his head to look directly up at him to show that he had his undivided attention. "We're boyfriends, right? That's okay? Could they call themselves yet?" He was itching to know if he could officially be boyfriends, partners, lovers. "Yeah, I think so," Todoroki answered, appearing to be thinking about the question a bit more. Neither of them had a relationship like this before, so he was probably just as thoughtful on the matter. "Would that make you happy?" Todoroki asked back and received a kiss to his forehead. "You make me happy," Midoriya giggled. But then Todoroki placed his chopsticks in his box and reached for the other's hand. He played with his fingers for a few moments before pinching his sleeve and pulling it back. He could see some skin that was scabbed and irritated for occasional scratching. Appearing displeased, he began to trace the scabs carefully with his fingertip. "You don't hurt yourself when you're happy?" he questioned, poking at a part of his skin that wasn't wounded. He wanted to make him happy regardless, but he would work extra hard to make sure he didn't harm himself. Yeah, that's right." Midoriya took his hand back with a blush and used it to pet the silky two-colored hair, just as Todoroki liked, watching him close his eyes peacefully at the action. Their peaceful time together was suddenly interrupted by a blaring alarm. Todoroki sat up instantly at the sound while Midoriya remained calm, even smirking at the sound as his eyes regained their subtle glow of mischief. Big Brother was finally placing his cards. "That's a security alarm," Todoroki said, looking around for the source of a possible intrusion. "Is someone attacking?" He was about to stand up when the little villain gently wrapped his arms around his neck and placed his chin on his shoulder from behind. "Relax. It's probably nothing." He slowly pulled him to have him lean his back into his chest as he held him lovingly. Although the taller boy was more than strong enough to deny his hold, he submitted to it, finding comfort in it that overpowered his anxiety. "You're safe here. You're safe with me," he nearly cooed, stroking his cheek with the back of his fingers. It was very soon, within minutes, that they would notice the main entrance was open with a small crowd of news reporters standing in its place. Aizawa and Yamada were there, holding the ground between them and the building. "They're technically trespassing, so they're kinda like villains. So why don't we just beat them up?" Yamada said quietly with an annoyed expression. He could tell that the students must be stressed out inside trying to evacuate all at once from the same room. "We just want to ask All Might a few questions." "Is that so much to ask?" The press pressed, trying to coax the teachers into letting them in. Aizawa only glared in frustration. Journalists were always so obnoxious to him. "I know how you people work. You get an inch and you expect a mile," Aizawa said sternly with his eyes narrowed. "You're disturbing my students. Leave now before we call for authorities. And besides, it's his day off." Todoroki couldn't hear the situation at the front gate, but he could tell that there was no obvious danger. Then he turned to see one of the hallways, through a line of windows, that it was completely clogged with panicked students attempting to leave the cafeteria all at once. It was an even more intense stampede than the one that enters during lunch period. Someone was bound to get hurt, trampled, or worse. With that thought in mind, Todoroki escaped Midoriya's hold thoughtlessly and stood up. "Ida," he said to himself, running off towards the windows. Midoriya's eyes went red hearing that name come from his beloved's lips. Even after everything he's done for him, that four-eyed bastard was still on his mind. Why couldn't he just forget Ida? Why couldn't he just see him and him alone? Why, after all this, did he still hold on to his worthless classmates? But Midoriya knew, even though he desperately wanted to, he could not bluntly pull Todoroki away from those he had desperately become attached to. Even though he wanted to scream at him, to demand from him to only give him his attention, it would be cruel to him. So reluctantly he followed him to the windows. Todoroki watched through the glass as Kirishima, Kaminari, and Siro were practically swept away trying to calm the panicking students down. He tried knocking on the glass to get anyone's attention, to tell them that nothing was wrong, but no one heard. "Someone's going to get hurt," he mumbled, taking out his phone and going to an app to type something out. "Who cares? They're only trying to be popularized liars." Midoriya wanted to tell him to just forget them, to come to cuddle with him under the trees again. Instead, he watched him desperately search for someone through the glass. And it was soon that the very person he was worried about was squished up against a panel. "Ida." Todoroki ran to his classmate that was being pressed against the glass and waved at him to be sure he got his attention. They couldn't hear each other, but he saw the engine-legged hero mouth his name in confusion, to which he would show him his phone screen. "There's no one attacking. A bunch of media workers broke the gate. I think they just want to see All Might. Mr. Aizawa and Mr. Yamada are taking care of it. Do you think you can tell everyone?" Ida read the message and looked around, thinking of an idea. He gritted his teeth as he was further pushed against the wall. Then he pointed upward. He needed to get high in the air for everyone to see him, to get everyone's attention. "You need to get up?" Todoroki asked meaninglessly, trying to be certain that he was reading his gesture correctly. Hoping he had the right assumption, he placed his hands on the glass to begin to freeze it, freeze through it, freeze the ground under Ida's feet, to make it rise and make him rise with it. He branched the ice to the ceiling, to create a bar that reached to the end of the hall and above the fire doors. He watched Ida grip the bar and use his engines to propel himself forward and get to the end. Although he did not brake quickly enough and slammed into the wall a bit harshly. What Midoriya would give to have him hang like that and use him as a target for knife throwing. That was brilliant, Todoroki. I admire your quick wit and precision with your quirk. Allow me to thank you on behalf of the other students for helping me ease the chaos. Ida shook Todoroki's hand enthusiastically in the hallway after the evacuation was done and everyone was allowed back in. You were the one that told everyone. I didn't do much. Todoroki said modestly. Midoriya stood behind him, glaring daggers at the blue-haired student before them. He wanted to bite his hand off. Give yourself more credit. You're amazing and you are incredibly kind. The tallest of the three took the half-and-half teenager's hand in both of his, clasping it warmly. You're modest too. You really are a great hero, Todoroki, he smiled. Midoriya nearly snapped as he watched a blush grow on his beloved's cheeks while he looked away shyly. How dare he? How dare he try pulling him away, coaxing him into a world of liars and false idols? His kindness was a fraud like the rest of them. How dare he try to take him back to the world he's been trying to free him from? I don't like the way he talks to you, Midoriya grumbled as they stood outside the school entrance as the evening drew near. The end of the school day had come and nearly everyone had left except a few teachers and the two students. Todoroki was not eager to return home, but Midoriya was not eager to leave the campus with this jealousy festering inside of him. That guy with the glasses. I don't like how he talks to you. It's like he's trying to take you away from me. Todoroki listened to the little villain and watched him begin to pry at his sleeves and quiver. I know he's nice to you. But how he looks at you, how he held your hand, how he talks to you. He's not better than me, is he? His hero wouldn't abandon him too, right? This genuine hero. He wasn't like the others, right? Maybe he liked taller guys. Maybe he preferred strong quirks. Maybe he liked constant confidence. Maybe the little villain wasn't good enough. But Todoroki took the little villain's hands before leaning down to peck his lips softly. I love Izuku. Not Ida. Midoriya looked up at his beloved, the sun behind his beautiful face. He felt his soft hand against his freckled cheek. No one can make me happier than you. Todoroki gently spoke, his calm aura cooling the tension and anxieties. No one knows me like you. He brought his hand up to kiss his palm. There's no one I trust like you. Midoriya's quivering eased slightly as he went forward to hug on to Todoroki, pressing his cheek into his shoulder. That's right, Todoroki wasn't like other heroes. If something happens again, you tell me right away. I'll be there. I'll get you out of there. And he still needed saving too. The two parted ways to return home. Midoriya put earbuds in to listen to a recording of Present Mix's latest podcasts. It was something he never stopped doing from when he was a kid to when he became a twisted doctor. Midoriya tossed his bag on the red sofa in the bar before sitting down on the stool next to Shigaraki. It was odd to not see Kurogiri behind the counter this time. And instead of a home-cooked meal or a balanced snack, all that was there was a half-eaten bag of chips. Regardless, he took a few to munch on. Is this dinner too? He asked. He had little doubt that his big brother knew the first thing about cooking. How were they going to survive a whole day without their fatherly figure? Yup, Shigaraki said while going through his phone, looking through news articles on the sudden disappearances. He needed to stay updated on where Endeavor's agency was going with the evidence that they had. The moment they would start to suspect Midoriya or get close to the bar would lead to a different course of action being taken. What are they doing these days? Midoriya asked, trying to peek by leaning over and up against Shigaraki. They've got the teleportation quirk user down. They know someone like Kurogiri is with us. Anything else? They know we go after people walking alone in secluded areas. More people have been out with a second to prevent me from getting to them. But that's all right, I have other means. Has Kosuke Hiro been labeled as missing yet? While you were at school. I don't know why his parents waited so long or if the police were stalling. I think they were trying to prevent panic in the public by not telling them that we go after kids too. Why does Kurogiri need to be gone all day? Couldn't he just go in, do the thing and leave? Kurogiri can warp to places he's been, not just to places that he wants to go. He's wandering the whole campus to make sure we can be dropped off in the best spot. It takes a while to sneak around without getting caught in a place like that. Any more questions? Shigaraki turned to Midoriya to see him resting his face comfortably against his arm. He never expected them to get this close and comfortable with each other. A part of him even ached at the sight of the scar on his eye. "Are you doing okay?" Midoriya asked his final question. It made Shigaraki blink a few times. That was such an odd question to ask. "Just tired," he admitted quietly. "Not a good sleeper?" "Me neither. Two tired boys. Two tired boys being tired together. How did you meet your master?" Midoriya then asked randomly. His eyes looked ready to close as he was leaning against his big brother. He hadn't realized how exhausted he was until he sat down. And now his curious mind was wandering. "I think I've repressed a lot, or something's been repressing things for me. I just remember being little, people walking past me, people ignoring me, being alone. I don't remember what I was feeling. Maybe hatred, maybe not. But I remember being relieved when he found me, offered his hand, and took me in." Midoriya nodded as he listened. Thinking about one of their first conversations, he remembered that Shigaraki was very understanding when he brought up why Todoroki meant so much to him. "How about your little Prince Charming?" the older villain asked. It made Midoriya scoff to himself and avert his eyes embarrassingly. "I almost jumped off a building when All Might crushed my dreams. Someone told me I should kill myself and hope for a quirk in my next life, and I was actually going to do it because no one believed in me. And I was really close too. But he came out of nowhere and stopped me. We talked and he inspired me to make an impact a different way. And ever since then I've been wanting to kill his bastard father because someone who saved me doesn't deserve to suffer in that ass's care." Midoriya had avoided telling Shigaraki he attempted suicide because he feared it would make him appear weak and unreliable for being too fragile-minded. But now, after the time they've spent working and living together, that fear was non-existent. Though he was caught a bit off guard when he felt an arm around his shoulders and someone's hand in his hair. "I'll kill the guy that told you to kill yourself," Shigaraki mumbled. "Kill Bakugo? Anything you hate, we'll find a way to destroy it. And I'm going to teach you how to do the basics of that." Midoriya looked to Shigaraki a bit confused and then felt him move. The taller villain got down from his stool and motioned for the little villain to follow him to the elevator. The elevator did not go far down when it brought them to a brightly lit room with a wood floor and traditional Japanese wall panels. It almost looked like an at-home dojo. "What's this about?" Midoriya asked, looking around and finding a closet in the wall filled with different blades of guards that could be attached to specific parts of the body as shields. "Ever since you came back with that scar on your face, I knew I had to find a teacher for you sooner rather than later. I'm still looking. But for now, I need to teach you how to protect yourself." Shigaraki wasn't about to bring Midoriya to a fight without any training or practice. This was a bit last second, but something was better than nothing. "I'm not the person to teach you how to hold a knife and stab someone efficiently." He couldn't even hold a knife correctly without destroying it. "So I'm going to teach you how to move and look." Midoriya appeared baffled, but something in his heart fluttered. He was getting a chance like this. A chance to be stronger even without a quirk. He looked at Shigaraki, who was across the room from him, but in a moment it was like he disappeared and reappeared closer but diagonally from where he was originally before disappearing again. And before the little villain knew it, he found himself on his back, looking up at the ceiling on the floor. He forgot how fast his older brother was. It was scary. "We'll start by training your eyes to keep up with me. You need to see things coming." Midoriya was allowed to change into a hoodie and sweatpants for this training so he could have more movement compared to when he was wearing his school uniform. But even with greater mobility, he was smacked around quite a bit. He would be tripped, flicked, tackled, punched but not too hard, kicked and choked over and over again. He was spotted in bruises from the neck down. Shigaraki was simply too quick for his eyes to follow, too agile to avoid, and too flexible to be dodged. There was improvement made where the older villain was forced to change his methods, but only slightly. This was all trial and error, using reflexes and rapid eye movement training. It wasn't much, but it was a start to get the little doctor on the battlefield without getting captured immediately. Breaks were granted, of course. Shigaraki was not about to be the type to torture Midoriya until he got it right. Training would take time and at least a few days, so he was going to stay patient and let the skills come and grow naturally and respectfully. All of this and a fair amount of praise would be enough to keep the little villain motivated. The idea of being believed in this much by his big brother had him beyond inspired. By the end of the evening, Midoriya was smiling cheerfully with confidence and eating a bunch of unhealthy snack foods for dinner because that's all they had. While the two ate together, Midoriya had pulled out one of his notebooks and began asking Shigaraki questions about his quirk and physical prowess, taking notes on everything he said. "You better not think about using me as one of your subjects," the older villain grumbled, but the other just snickered teasingly. "Never." As night approached, Midoriya went down to his laboratory to clean it as he had left it a mess when Kosuke was tortured and killed on his table. However, he was surprised to see that it was cleaned for him. He sighed at the sight of his stainless tools and shining table and desk. "Thanks, Dad," he mumbled. Kosuke's body was not on the table. The cage he had been imprisoned in was empty. With a shrug, Midoriya returned to the elevator to go up to his room and retire for the night. Yet, the moment the doors closed, the boy swore he heard a loud bang from the other side of the metal. But he ignored it. By the next morning, Kurogiri had returned to provide the two with a healthier meal in place of all the junk they consumed the evening before. He was also there to warp the boy to school where Todoroki would meet him near the entrance to the main building. Casual conversation would ensue and the taller boy would explain that nothing happened the other evening because Endeavor was called to a shady part of the city to help in the investigation of finding the missing Kosuke hero. Midoriya expected Todoroki to be relieved that he was left in peace, but found him to be rather anxious and bothered. "He went missing after he got suspended," he said, looking at his hands, remembering how that had wrapped so tightly around his throat. "It's my fault he got suspended." Midoriya was quick to take his hands to reassure him that his disappearance was not his fault. He smiled sweetly and told him to not let it eat at him. Just telling him to focus on his boyfriend? Just think about his boyfriend. Just think how happy his boyfriend makes him. Don't think about Kosuke. Think about me. The two parted to go to their separate classes, letting Midoriya walk past the teacher's lounge. Normally he would pay no mind to it, ignoring all the pros that would stay there to finish their teacher work, although it was usually empty at this time. However, this time he noticed two people in there with the door barely cracked open. It was likely that it was supposed to be closed. "He's missing. How could that even be? He's just a kid." Midoriya quietly went to the door to eavesdrop and watch through the little gap in the door. It was Aizawa and Yamada. Aizawa looked restless. He was just supposed to be punished for starting a fight and bullying Todoroki. How could he go missing? He was pacing back and forth as Yamada sat on one of the tables, just listening to him and appearing hurt and worried. Were they targeting him? Were they just waiting for an opportunity like this? Someone has to be pulling strings. Yamada stood up when he had heard enough, probably listening to him for a while now, and took him by the shoulders. It was the weekend. All of the kids were out. It was probably just a coincidence. You can't be driving yourself crazy over this, not when you have other students that are just as anxious. Midoriya watched Yamada pull Aizawa out of his view, but he heard them both go silent for a few moments. "We're just going to do what we can as teachers and as heroes to keep the students we have contact with safe. We'll have to leave the search for him to Endeavor, as much you can't stand the guy. He's a hero too, and I think he's capable." Midoriya heard the bell, as did the two teachers, and he made a run for it before he was caught listening to them when that conversation was meant to be kept private. But as suspected, many, if not all the students were on edge. After that false alarm of yesterday, and the declaration of Kosuke going missing, everyone was glancing out windows, peeking around corners, and refusing to go anywhere by themselves, to wander off campus alone. They all suspected an outside force, stalking and threatening them from higher ground. They were left helplessly oblivious to the snake that was sitting behind them in class, beside them in the hall, living amongst them and in their midst, camouflaged as an innocent student. And for days Endeavor's agency would ponder the disappearance of Kosuke Hiro. Teachers would be paranoid to leave their students unattended, worrying about what would happen to them as they walked back home in the evening. Students were fearful to walk home alone, family and friends meeting them halfway to make sure there was someone there to be a witness to anything. In a sea of worried, frightful people and heroes, a smirking quirkless boy was giggling in his murderous mischief. And the little villain would let the city live in their own paranoia as he put down the scalpel for some time to train his physical capabilities with his big brother. All the energy he had, made of the anticipation for a surprise he had set up, needed to be worked off. Almost to the end of the school week, much of the anxiety in the students did not fade away yet. Even in Todoroki. Though his anxiety was not made of fear, rather it was guilt and confusion. He and Kosuke had never gotten along, not even for a few minutes. Not once were they kind to each other. To have such a poor relationship with someone who had gone missing ate at his conscience, though Midoriya was always there to soothe him and tell him that it was not his fault that their friendship was non-existent. Midoriya could see the distraction in his training. His head was not focused on the tasks at hand. His ice was scattered and without a pattern, and his hand-to-hand combat was sloppier though still impressive. Though the same could be said to all of Class 1A. Even Bakugo's rage was more intense and thus making his movements more direct and predictable as well as destructive. Aizawa was bound to mark everyone down, but probably not as harshly as he usually would, thanks to All Might's suggestions to take it easy on the students. It was lunch period. Everyone was walking to class. The stampede that had taken place at the start of the semester had filtered out due to other students timing themselves to not all leave at once. But everyone was walking slower than usual. Many were covering their noses. A rotten, disgusting odor was plaguing the hall to the cafeteria. Some had covered their mouths as the air even tasted revolting. Many complained and decided to just turn around and skip lunch as the smell ruined their appetite. It would make any weak-stomached person vomit. Yet Midoriya appeared undisturbed by it in the crowd, echoing with complaints of the stench. What the actual hell? Can someone just open a window? Bakugo growled, covering his nose and mouth. His eyes were darting all over to try and find a source, ready to show no mercy if it was just someone's body odor. That person wouldn't be alive any longer if it was, but this stench was far too strong for it to be something as basic as that. Maybe an animal crawled in a vent or something, Kirishima said, trying to think of a valid answer as he walked beside him. They weren't particularly close, they've hardly even spoken to each other. But they were forced side by side by the crowd. Half and half, can you go any faster? I want to get in to get away from this smell. It reeks. They were both behind a few students, but directly in front of Bakugo was Todoroki. Can only go as fast as everyone else. Todoroki was going to apologize but was cut off by surprise when a drop of liquid dripped onto his nose. He completely stopped, making the grumpy blonde bump into him. Why the hell did you stop? Keep dash. Bakugo shouted before he too stopped speaking when a drop fell onto his cheek. What the? He swiped his thumb over the drop and saw that it was dark red, almost black. He, Todoroki, and Kirishima all looked up at the ceiling to see the crevice between two tiles had a dark liquid dripping down below with a dark splotch staining the ceiling. Bakugo narrowed his eyes and slowly backed up, raising his arms to the side to keep other students back from the stain that appeared to be growing ever so subtly. Todoroki backed up in the opposite direction to also clear the way from any students walking underneath the leak. Kirishima stepped out from underneath and looked around to see some students carrying on their way while others were noticing the dark spot above them. So many drops had fallen at this point, a small puddle was beginning to form on the ground. The wretched odor was strongest in the very spot they were standing in. It was then the angered look in Bakugo's facial altered into something that made Midoriya smirk crookedly in the distance. "Guys, I think I should get Mr. Aizawa," Kirishima said quietly, ready to make his way to the teacher's lounge when there was a loud cracking in the ceiling that gained everyone's attention. A portion of the ceiling collapsed. Something had been weighing it down from the inside and ruining the material it was made of. A corpse. A corpse fell from the ceiling. The dead body of Kosuke Hiro had fallen from inside the ceiling above the three students. It reeked of decay. Megos had begun to infest it. Its chest and torso had been ripped open with its insides mangled from stabbing and cutting, and blackened with burns. The inside of its jaw had been burned and flesh weakened so it appeared to barely be dangling to the rest of its face. It landed on its back, its head lolled back as its eyes appeared to deadly stare at Todoroki, leaving the rest of its decayed, rotting self on display for the students around to bask in terror. Todoroki, Kirishima, and Bakugo had all been splashed in reeking and darkened blood that flew out when the body hit the hard floor. The three were left silent and paralyzed at the sight of their slaughtered classmate while many of the other students screamed and ran from the scene. Pushing, shoving, crying, shrieking, nearly all that had happened in the last alarm from the unknown was now happening much more intensely from the known. The body of the missing boy had been hiding amongst them all this time had now shown itself in its horrific glory. But the little villain, standing still with a crooked grin, was not finished with his surprise. With his hands behind his back, up against the wall, inside his shirt, he held a small device that consisted of a single button. He pressed it once. And somewhere in the building, there was a small explosion, but not one of gunpowder and fire. Students that had tried to flee by turning back were sprayed with a blast of preserved blood that had been set up to blow up in their faces. At the moment the blood packet exploded, the screams became louder to be followed by more intense and frantic crying. Make an impact. He would make an impact. He'd let these students and pros see something they'd never forget. Todoroki had fallen back with his hands propping himself up, all he was able to do in his paralysis of fear. The corpse of his former bully was staring at him. Blood was all over its face, its ripped open torso clear for him to see. Its arms splayed out from the fall, skin pale and torn with death and decay. He couldn't break eye contact with it. He couldn't look away from it. Its jaw was left wide open to see into its mouth, to see its burnt tongue infested with maggots, its skull beginning to crawl out of its flesh. And yet its opened eyes were staring into him. The dulled golden eyes pierced him, locking him in his place on the floor. The disgusting death of his classmate, the cruel death of his former bully, the disrespectful placement of the body. What could have happened? Bakugo and Kirishima's legs had both given into the weight of the air, causing them both to collapse before the corpse of their former classmate, left to stare at the revolting entrails and revealed bones. They too were paralyzed by the sight. Bakugo shook in his mental struggle to move again, to move and run away, to get as far away from this thing as possible. What, W? He could hardly bring himself to speak. The student who always had something to say, something to scream, and now he had such difficulty speaking a single sentence. W? Happened to Yu? He asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Amongst the chaos, it wasn't long for the teachers to sprint out of the lounge to be greeted with students running past them, covered in blood, only for another small explosion to go off and spray more on them as they tried to exit out of an emergency door. Many of the older students had taken the charge to guide the younger students out safely. All Might appeared in his muscle form beside both Aizawa and Yamada, the three nearly stunned by the scene at hand. There was blood everywhere from little explosions that were going off at random in almost every hall. At the moment, the teachers were mortified at the unknown fact of whether the blood drenching the kids was their own or someone else's. Were they hurt? Were they being attacked? What were they running from? There were so many of them fleeing, crying. Some were even frozen in the corners, being too frightened to move. What if there was an enemy outside waiting for them? Waiting to do what had been done to the missing boy. With haste and little time for hesitation, All Might improvised by punching a hole in the wall where a door was to make it bigger and more accessible to more students. With great speed, he bolted around, picking up students that were stuck in shock, collecting them in his arms and taking as many as he could find and carry. Yamada did what he could, guiding the newer students to closest exits while on his phone with other staff members. Is it safe outside? Are there villains out there? He asked, wanting to be sure that he wasn't leading the kids into more danger. We've surveyed the campus, we couldn't find anyone. What's going on in there? The one on the line was Pro Hero 13. I don't know. Shoyuda went ahead to find out. Yamada continued outside to guide as many students out as he could find. And then with his loud voice and flashy appearance, he began separating students by class to make sure everyone was accounted for. Thankfully, the kids knew better to stick with most of their class, letting those who've strayed away rejoin them instead. However, when it came to his own class, he nearly became frantic. Where's Midoriya? He asked, searching amongst his class. Boys and girls were covered in blood, huddling together for comfort while a few were standoffish. Half of Shinso's face was blanketed in red, and yet he kept his distance from the rest and was also looking for his freckled classmate. Shinso, have you seen him? Yamada took his shoulders and asked. I think he was close to where the body fell. Yamada's grip tightened slightly. Body? What body? He shook his head. He didn't want an answer from a kid. Stay here, make sure no one goes anywhere unless a teacher says so. I'm entrusting them to you, all right? Surely this was not the time to put pressure on a new student. But he trusted him to be responsible and make the best choices he could. And with a hesitant nod as an answer, Yamada ran back into the building as fast as he could. Midoriya? Going back in, the building was practically silent, abandoned. The halls splattered with blood, loose papers scattered and drenched, neglected backpacks, and some uniform blazers left behind. He paused before going in further. He never thought teaching would bring him back to a near war-zone-like site. But he ignored his racing thoughts and ran further inside, following the footprints left behind in blood from students' shoes. He had to go to where they were running from. And thus the three teachers were reunited in the hall leading to the main entrance of the cafeteria. Bakugo, Kirishima, and Todoroki were still stuck in shock where they had fallen back. Bakugo still shook violently, trying to bring his body to move away from the corpse that was still before them, its blood pooled around it and reaching the teenagers around it. Aizawa had also found himself frozen place at the sight of the corpse of his dead student at the same side of the hallway as Yamada. Yamada wrapped his arms around him from behind, hugging his chest tightly. Don't look at it. Don't look at it. Focus on the kids. We need to get out of here, he said quietly with his forehead against the back of his neck. All Might stood at the opposite end of the hall and was shocked by the sight of the mangled corpse. Surely he's seen worse elsewhere. But this was a child, his student. Kosuke had been a bully and a disruptive boy, but he couldn't bring himself to believe he deserved this kind of death. All Might approached Kirishima and Bakugo from behind as they were closest to him. He knelt down and carefully took the blonde in one arm and the redhead in the other, lifting them away from the fallen body. I am here, he said quietly. He was here for the two teenagers in his arms. But he couldn't be there for the one that had been stuffed in the ceiling for days. He looked to Todoroki, who was still unable to break eye contact with the corpse, unmoving and silent. It was then Yamada and Aizawa got on either side of Todoroki, both taking hold of his arms to try and break him out of his trance. Todoroki, we have to go. Aizawa shook him slightly but couldn't get a response from him. Todoroki, can you hear me? A few explosions had gone off. Aizawa wondered if one was ever close to his head that hurt his hearing. We need to get out of here. Can you stand? Yamada tried getting his attention, but it was no use. His focus was centered on the dead body, entranced by the revealed organs and bones, the lifeless wide eyes, the dangling jaw and limpness of the whole body. He almost killed Kosuke one afternoon. And here was, dead in front of him. This is what he wanted, wasn't it? Shuto, a sweet voice called from behind, coming closer at a calm pace, causing Todoroki to finally blink. Midoriya appeared from around a corner, soaked in blood as well with his blazer off and over his shoulder. He smiled so softly, too naturally given the situation. The freckled boy walked around to kneel down in front of Todoroki and cup his cheeks, having raise his gaze from the corpse to his beloved with glowing green eyes. We have to go, okay? We have to go outside with everyone else. You'll come with me, won't you? He asked, attempting to wipe away some blood on the taller boy's face with his blazer, but it only smudged. Todoroki nodded slowly and let Midoriya take his hands to pull him up from the ground. Aizawa and Yamada were left in shock at the quirkless boy's calmness and smiling face. Yamada presumed it was a false face of courage he was putting on for the sake of someone he truly cares about. But in those glowing green hues, Aizawa swore he saw something different. Something that wasn't safe. Authorities and people of Endeavor's agency rushed the building as soon as everyone was evacuated. Ambulances were lined up, tending to any injuries that may have occurred during the sudden stampede when the body fell. Every student that was present that day was officially accounted for in groups on campus. Todoroki and Midoriya, Bakugo and Kirishima were reunited with their classmates as the classes were placed right next to each other in the field. Kaminari and Shiro hurried to Kirishima's side when they were set down by All Might, worried for their friend. Dude, are you alright? What happened in there? Kaminari asked without thinking, but then realized that Kirishima probably didn't want to talk about it. And never mind. Don't think about it. Instead, Shiro and Kaminari found it better to just lightly hug onto his shoulders, just letting him know that they were there. And yet the redhead reached to take hold of Bakugo's sleeve in a death grip. Without a second thought, Bakugo did the same to him, finding just a minuscule amount of strength to move again. Midoriya walked Todoroki to sit under a tree, the one where they had recently been sitting under at lunch. The freckled boy still smiled softly, sitting on his knees behind his beloved hero and gently petting his hair. Todoroki! As much as he hated that voice, he still kept up his smile. Ida ran away from a conversation at the sight of Todoroki being returned to the rest of the class, but Midoriya held a hand up in front of them before. He could come any closer. Give him space. He just needs space right now. He hummed, nuzzling into his neck, keeping up with the petting. He took his hand back and wrapped it around his hero's chest, to hold him closer. Todoroki's eyes were half-lidded in mental exhaustion and weakness, most of his body limp from the shock. He had nothing to say to anyone at the moment, stuck in his own head and only hearing Midoriya's words. Ida gulped and was hesitant to argue with the shorter boy. So he sat down and let them both be, though watchful eyes in the distance were much more suspicious than he was. Aizawa had been trying to comfort a few of his students, but he looked over at Midoriya and narrowed his eyes in a glare. He watched the boy move his hand from Todoroki's hair to cover his eyes, still holding him at his chest and whispering into his ear, eyes glowing brightly and a smile crookedly wide on his face. You don't need to fear Shudo. I'm here. Parents came. Mothers and fathers of all walks of life came in a hurry to take their children away from the school grounds. No one was going to be left to walk home alone this afternoon. One by one, students were collected by emergency care stations to have detectives and EMTs take samples of the blood that had been splattered onto any of the children. It was after that and a quick checkup were the families allowed to leave the campus. There were cries from both the adults and teenagers, the wave of relief in all of them that the corpse was not their son, and that the corpse was not them. Midoriya sat back against a tree with Todoroki leaning the back of his head against his chest, limply exhausted and only finding comfort in the little villain's petting and his occasional soft words. There was a point that the dual-haired student closed his eyes and drifted off into resting his eyes. No one would probably come for him. Endeavor was already on the campus grounds, so his parent was already here to take him home when he was ready to leave. Half of him didn't want to leave. Somehow sitting in the presence of a tortured corpse while in his beloved's arms was more appealing than being home with his father. Someone would have to take care of Zuzu. Fuyumi would. He could rest in relief at the thought of her taking care of his newfound pet. Some students would have to wait longer than others due to parent work schedules and how far away some of them were to the school. But when the news and the phone calls began, most came faster than they ever had before. The area where Yamada and Aizawa's class sat, the few who remained were Shinso, Uraraka, and a few strays from the general studies course. Some of their families were likely not as fortunate in wealth and would not be allowed to leave their jobs in a timely manner or find an inexpensive way to travel as quickly as possible. Midoriya had seen Aizawa sit down next to Uraraka and occasionally make conversation. There wasn't much else he could do but wait with her. Inko came. She had come to the front gates in panicked tears when she saw students covered in blood walking out with family to leave. What had become of her Izuku? Was he just as frightened as all the others? Was he by himself, waiting for her? She had sent him to this school with such high hopes and great expectations. Who would have imagined that he would be living with someone she's never met and be coming to take him away after a terrible scene? She hasn't seen him in so long. She's missed him. When she was guided to where the two classes were, she was in shock to see him gently smiling, petting a boy's hair she didn't recognize, looking as calm as could be. She saw the scar on his eye. Where had that come from? Who had done that to her precious baby? Izuku, she choked. Midoriya looked up at his mother, deer in the headlights expression. How would he explain any of this to her? He couldn't tell her the whole truth. Todoroki slowly opened his eyes, looking to the woman that was standing in front of them, her hands balled near her chin with her face wet from tears. She looked like such a delicate woman. Pure and heartful. Midoriya was her spitting image. Hi mom. Midoriya greeted a bit awkwardly with a smile and eyebrows curled inward. He stopped petting Todoroki, but he still held him close. How Inko would love to hug her son, but this mysterious boy covered in dark blood was between them, but she was not bitter to him. The two boys appeared to be close. Instead, she got onto her knees in front of them, her hands were fists on her thighs. Izuku, I need some answers, okay? She pressed. Was this really the place or the time? Midoriya gulped but nodded. He had to explain himself at some point. Are you okay? She asked. Before anything, she just had to know if he was okay. And he was immediately baffled by the question. Are you okay? Is there anything you need to tell me? I killed someone. I've killed a few people now. All after I almost killed myself. I'm okay, Mom, really. I'm not hurt or anything. He felt so bad for her. She was being left in complete darkness like this. Do you want to go home with me? Can you please come home? She sounded ready to beg him to come back. He would rather not. But he didn't want to send Todoroki home like this, he didn't want to leave him alone with his father, and yet he couldn't have Kurogiri pick them up. Todoroki would see him. Can he come with us? Midoriya asked, hugging his beloved hero a little tighter, making his eyes open up a bit more. Inko had never seen this boy before, but she could tell that he was important to her son. Did he have anything to do with him turning out like this? He can if they'll let me sign for him. She obliged. Aizawa let Inko sign to take Todoroki home with her, all while glaring at Endeavor having a short meeting with a few police officers. He'd rather send his student to a woman he's never met than the number 2 hero. And yet this felt almost as unsettling. While Inko signed the paperwork for 2 students and watched blood be swiped off of them for sampling, he couldn't help making more than a few glances at Midoriya. The freckled boy was as calm as could be. He had been smiling nearly the whole time. He's been by Todoroki's side since they found him inside. The teacher remembered the day Todoroki snapped in the cafeteria when he got into a fight with Kosuke. Midoriya went after Kosuke even though he knew he couldn't win. Was the boy so heartless to not be affected by his death? Or was he thankful for it? Hopeful? Or maybe he even expected it? Aizawa had to watch Inko hug the little villain with her whole heart displayed in her every notion, and yet the little villain hardly broke his half-smiling face, hugging her back out of pity and obligation. As soon as she let go, he gravitated to Todoroki, taking his hand and leading him away from campus. The car ride was completely silent. Midoriya wouldn't even sit in the passenger seat as he preferred to stay in the back with Todoroki. The taller boy was still in a spaced-out state and thus blankly stared out the window for the whole few minutes he was in the car. Midoriya only smiled and nearly giggled when he noticed something, but he stayed quiet. He leaned up a bit and reached up to Todoroki's hair, but instead of petting him he began picking tiny bits of things out from amongst the strands. He had noticed them while he was petting him earlier but didn't want to stop because he knew he liked it. Inko looked in the rearview mirror to watch her son cheerfully pick out small red bits out of the other boy's hair and was nearly horrified when she realized what they were. Kosuke decomposed quicker than the little villain expected, and he never expected him to be so clingy in death either. Little pieces of his insides had made their way into Todoroki's hair when his corpse fell. Such filth had to be removed from his beautiful beloved. He was sure to toss the small handful out the window into the road, probably to be crushed by other traffic into nothing but a stain on the pavement. Taking the boys up to the apartment, Inko unlocked the door for them, removing her shoes and watching the two do the same. Hers were clean and dainty, and she saw shoes drenched in dark blood be set down, and another pair covered in red spatter. She saw Todoroki's socks even had dark stains on them. He had practically been sitting in a puddle of the corpse's blood. So, Inko didn't know where to begin. She had so many questions for Midoriya, but it wasn't right to ask them the moment they walked through the door. And now she had this stranger, covered in blood and clearly in a state of shock in her home. "What's your name, sweetie?" Hopefully, they didn't have to be strangers. "Are your parents all right with you staying here after all that?" Todoroki nodded tiredly. Todoroki Shudo. "It'll be fine. Endeavor will be more focused on the crime scene anyway." Inko blinked. Endeavor? Endeavor, the flame hero Endeavor was his parent? She put her hands to her cheeks and nearly had a panic attack. The son of a pro hero, a celebrity, in her apartment. How did her son become so close to someone like him? She looked around to see if her living space was a mess because she couldn't remember how she left it. She nearly shrieked at the remains of takeout she had last night still on the table, dishes in the sink, a few books and magazines were scattered on the couch. Such an important guest, and this is what her home looked like. Oh dear, this place is a mess. So sorry boys. I'll clean up right dash, Inko cried. She watched Midoriya latch onto Todoroki's arm and put his chin on his shoulder. Why don't you take a shower, Shudo? You can take one first and get cleaned up. I'll find something for you to wear too, the freckled villain suggested. Midoriya showed Todoroki to the bathroom, showed him how the shower worked, and left him to his privacy. He imagined he would be in there for a while, giving him time to find clothes that would fit him and have a conversation with his mother. Though that conversation came sooner than expected as Inko was standing right outside the bathroom door, eyes brimming with tears. It made the little villain's heart ache. I know. I have a lot of explaining to do. I have a lot of lying to do. The two began cleaning up the apartment together in the politeness of their guest who was locked away in the bathroom. Midoriya was picking up the leftovers that were on the table, noticing that there was one plate with crumbs and one with nothing on it, but still on the table nonetheless. Where have you been going? I know you've been sneaking out since your break in middle school. Izuku, I never questioned it because you always came home unscathed and I never heard of any trouble. Don't tell me you've betrayed my trust. Inko questioned him. She was angry, it was all too clear. But she wouldn't understand. Someone who had so little faith in his potential would never understand. I used to just go out for walks. But one time I met someone. He was really cool, he's nice. He's smart and he's really funny when you don't take him seriously. We have lots in common, and he's been really supportive of me and helped me study to be in the medical program. He lives with his dad across town and they let me sleep over all the time. Midoriya smiled, placing all the garbage in the trash can. It's not that I don't like being with you, Mom. I can't stand being here with you. I can't stand the lying I have to do. But they help me with my studies. I'm the best in class. They're closer to the school so I can sleep in. And his dad is Kurogurt. His smile was still on his face, but it wasn't enough to hold a few tears back. His dad is always there. For me. Inko bit her bottom lip as she held a small stack of magazines in her hands. How could she compete with that? The company of a friend and a father figure. Midoriya had never brought friends over before, so of course, he would cling to the first person he got along with. And they're helping him in his studies. She didn't know the first thing about medical education. These people were giving him things that she could never provide. Okay, could you at least call me sometimes? A text even? Could you do that for me? That's all she could ask for. Just to know if he was okay. Yeah. I'll try to do it more often. He'll probably ask Kurogiri to send letters. Letters couldn't be tracked that way. They began washing the dishes together, Inko washing and Midoriya drying and putting them in their proper places. Where did that mark on your eye come from? She asked. Midoriya knew that one was coming. He scratched his cheek with an awkward giggle. I may have gotten into a fight at school. Midoriya Izuku. Midoriya jumped at his full name being called like that and nearly dropped the glass he was holding, juggling it in his hands trying to get a good grasp on it again. I did it to protect Todoroki. He tried to defend himself. Todoroki had a bully at school and it was getting pretty bad. It was going on for weeks and I couldn't watch it happen anymore. He reached up to put the glass on a shelf with the others before going to the strainer and picking up a few pieces of silverware. Inko appeared to have become nervous. Izuku, when you say had? Inko asked nervously. Parents were at least vaguely informed as to what happened inside the school that day. They know the dead body of a missing student fell from the ceiling and harmless explosives filled with blood were set up everywhere. They knew someone died. Inko didn't even want to consider the possibility. Her precious, adorable little boy would never get into a fight. But the scar on his face, she had to believe that he did. But to think she watched him open a drawer and put a few utensils away, and the last one in his hand was a kitchen knife that he was staring at. Please say that the student just changed schools. But the bright red glow in his eyes said something different. Yeah, it was the dead kid. He turned to her with an innocent smile. He tried to step on Todoroki's head and then he scratched my face. He got me good, there was blood everywhere. But it's all right now. He put the knife down in the drawer and casually strolled over to take a plate. Everything's all right now. Midoriya began sweeping the floor and Inko was cleaning the windows. She could see that the city streets were a little emptier than normal. People were staying home. Staying home with their kids, no doubt. Reminding to tell their family they love them. Are you and Todoroki friends? She asked. He's my boyfriend, he answered. Midoriya answered quickly, without hesitation. He wanted to say it. Oh, well, that's wonderful, dear. Inko didn't quite know how to respond, but she was happy for him at least, though she never expected him to lean towards boys. She knew he had gotten flustered around pretty girls when he was younger, so perhaps he just liked both. But now it was only Todoroki. His dad doesn't know. But my friend's dad does, so he lets him stay over too. Inko didn't have the apartment space to house another child comfortably. She probably couldn't afford it either. She couldn't compete against these people her son was living with. Do we have something he could wear? I doubt my stuff will fit him, and I don't want him putting those bloody clothes on again. If they really couldn't find anything, Midoriya would just text Kurogiri to drop them off outside the apartment complex at some point. I still have some of your father's old shirts? Inko answered. He wanted to snap the broomstick in half. Is that really all they had? Would he have to wear that nobody's clothes? Just for tonight, but only that night. He was quick to text Kurogiri a message to drop off clothes the next morning. Midoriya was given an old white t-shirt that would probably be even too big for Todoroki. It would be enough for a nightshirt, but the little villain still wasn't happy about it. His hero didn't deserve to wear some deadbeats' abandoned clothes. He left it in the bathroom for the other to grab when he was finished. The moment Todoroki came out, Midoriya stole a quick peck on the lips before going through the door behind him to take a quick shower as well. Though he planned to make it only a few minutes long, giving Inko only a few minutes to say what she needed to say. Todoroki had gone to the sofa to sit down only to have Inko sit down beside him. She wasn't angry at him, and that wasn't the aura he was getting from her. He was silent, but she had his attention. He had always been a good listener. I haven't been able to speak to my son in a very long time. And I have no right to drag you into any of my dilemmas or troubles. I don't know you that well. But Todoroki, can I just ask a favor of you? Inko began. Deep in her gut, she knew that this was probably the last time she would see her son for a while. She couldn't compare to his new friend and that father he spoke about. She couldn't give Todoroki a place to stay every other night. She couldn't provide for the son of the number 2 hero's needs. She wasn't who they wanted, she wasn't the one they needed. I hate to burden you like this, especially after such a terrible thing this afternoon. But please, take care of my little boy. She began to softly cry. I'm such a terrible mother. I can't make him stay here with me, I know he wants nothing to do with me here. He has his eyes on his future and I just want what's best for him and to give him what he wants. But if you really are his boyfriend, and you do care for him, could you please look out for him for me? She took his hands, a sobbing mess. He's impulsive. He's one-track-minded. Sometimes he forgets to take care of himself when he gets focused. He moves and speaks before he thinks. I just want to know that someone is taking care of him. Todoroki listened to Inko, and even though he had only just met this woman, his heart hurt for her. She was trying so hard to make the best decision, even though it was painful to come to the conclusion that she has. She was so loving. She had nothing but love to give. She took her hands back and began to wipe her tears away. I'm sorry, sweetie. I shouldn't dash. Oh. I promise I'll do it. Todoroki didn't mean to cut her off, but he didn't want her to apologize. I think you're a great mother. You love him. She made him miss his own mom. I'll do what I can, everything I can. I'll take care of him, protect him, whatever he needs me to do. His face was tired, his body was exhausted. Who knew what his mind was? But there was a light in his left eye that was sharp and alive, contrasting his half-dead tone. I'll do anything for him. He could promise her that. A more peaceful evening was able to take place after their conversation. Todoroki laid on the sofa with Midoriya on top of him, his cheek resting on his shoulder with the TV on in the background playing a random cartoon. Inko was in the kitchen preparing a light meal for them all, occasionally looking back at the two and smiling to herself. Even if he was only here for a little while, she was enjoying it. And now she had someone to look out for him for her, and that gave her peace of mind. However, it was soon that the phone began to ring, gaining all three's attention. Inko picked it up and held it to her ear. Hello. She looked to both the boys. Yes, they are. She looked up at the ceiling. What? That was a very panicked what. She was quiet for a little bit, listening to the voice on the other line. Is that really necessary? It was just this afternoon. I understand, but, okay, she sounded very defeated at the end. After a few more words, she hung up and went over to the sofa with her hands folded together. Try not to get too freaked out, but that was the police. They want you both at the city police station for questioning tomorrow morning. Was it because of the fight? Was it because Todoroki was closest to the fall? Were they questioning all the students or just them? Midoriya looked to his mother and then to his boyfriend, who suddenly appeared even more tired than before. To be questioned on the incident so soon, Endeavor's agency wasn't messing around. The heroes were getting impatient for answers. Dinner had been mostly silent, with occasional small conversations between Midoriya and Inko. Although it was barely sundown, with darkness in the sky, still a flow of oranges and yellows, the little villain thought it would be best to put himself and Todoroki to bed. He couldn't help but blush at the thought. There was only one room here. He wasn't about to let his beloved hero sleep on the floor either. Going into his room, he forgot how empty it looked now. Most of his All Might posters were taken down, his figures were stashed away, his bedding set was inside out to hide the All Might designs. He tried to ignore it, preferring his room at the bar instead. He shut the door behind them and took Todoroki's hand with a soft smile. Come on, he whispered, lightly pulling him, and he followed. Todoroki laid down at the edge of the bed, but Midoriya wrapped his arms around his shoulders and pulled him closer to the middle and proceeded to hug him close to his chest. He reached over him to turn the lamp off at his bedside before sinking down a bit to put their foreheads together and close his eyes. You want to talk about it? He asked softly. You can tell me anything you're thinking. He wanted to hear everything he was thinking. He opened his eyes to reveal a soft glow. It was very pretty in the darkness of the room. It was mischievous, it was evil, but it was loving. He watched Todoroki avert his gaze. He was thinking something. He can't hurt you anymore. I'm relieved. Midoriya hummed with a smile, beginning to twirl white hair with his index finger. You were so miserable at school. You tried very hard not to let it show, but I can tell when something's wrong. Now you won't have to pretend anymore, things can just be fine. There were so many positives to this. Couldn't he see them? And imagine if he actually became a hero? He wouldn't help a soul. And the others would probably just leave him be and do nothing to correct him. Like your father. Look at what I've prevented, what I've done for you. Aren't you happy? Todoroki was looking down at their feet, but he was listening. Occasionally his focus would shift to Midoriya's hands or his shirt, just anything but his face for the time. He looked unsure. Is it really okay to say those things? Was it okay to be happy about someone's death? Good people don't wish death onto others, and good people don't celebrate the deaths of others. Hearing Midoriya find all these positives amongst the tragedy, something felt off. You shouldn't feel restricted saying anything. It hurts more to hold your thoughts back, doesn't it? Midoriya smiled softly, moving his hand to put it under Todoroki's chin and raise his gaze. He made his hero look at his face, to make eye contact with glowing hues. You're really beautiful when you're yourself. Such alluring emerald eyes and a silver tongue that made every word sound so comforting. I mean, you wanted him dead too, didn't you? The scar on his own face was but a reminder of the day Kosuke was almost killed. Midoriya loved to remember how enraged Todoroki was, an elegant fallen angel, a demon in hellfire. Remember how angry you were? Remember how he hurt me? I never knew I could have fallen more in love with you until I saw your fire. Praise. Midoriya's soft words were sprinkled with kindness and love. He watched Todoroki's eyes glimmer in response. He could feel his hero's heart beat harder in his chest. Todoroki wasn't sad about Kosuke's death. He wouldn't miss him. He didn't feel bad for him. He didn't care. He felt the pressure to care. But Midoriya stripped it all away. Todoroki began but felt something catch his throat. It was physically hard to say, difficult to admit it and come to terms with how he truly felt. Midoriya leaned in closer, kissing his cheek gently. What? He cooed, tempting the words to come out. What is it, Shudo? He held his chin with one hand, forbidding him to look away while twirling his hair a bit, playfully guiding the truth. He deserved it, Todoroki mumbled, looking up at the killer that was cheerfully smiling at him. Midoriya hummed as if he didn't hear his answer, teasing him to say it again. He felt Todoroki tightly cling to his shoulders and bury his face into his neck. He deserved it, every bit of it. For hurting you, Todoroki said a bit louder, feeling the villain wrap his arms around him in a hug. What else did he do? He wanted him to feel that hatred. Fester in it. Embrace it and not be afraid of it. He hurt me. Midoriya nuzzled his nose into his hair. Tell me more. Just let everything out. I hated him. I wanted him to die. Every day he toyed with me, I just wanted him dead. I wanted him to leave me alone and disappear forever. I hated him. I hated him so much. I wanted to kill him. Midoriya could feel his neck become a bit wet but said nothing of it. He simply hugged Todoroki closely and giggled ever so innocently. The taller boy had been shaking the entire time he spoke, and it was then that he was feeling him ease his nerves. He had been gritting his teeth tightly in anger. But after his venting, his body was releasing the tension and falling into a restful state. Midoriya gently stroked his shoulder, lulling his beloved hero with tear-stained cheeks to sleep. I wanted to kill him too. The two had gone to sleep mid-evening. But at the same time, the UA campus was not cleared just yet. A few detectives and heroes lingered, investigating the entire area to be sure that it would be safe to return to in a few days. Needless to say that classes would be cancelled for a little while. Most of the students were gone, almost all of them were taken home. All except one. With the night sky beginning to flow in, a lonely tired boy was sitting in the grass amongst the investigation teams, picking at the grass and simply waiting. Yamada and Aizawa were still there as well. They wanted to stay for the sake of receiving any information firsthand, but also to have supervision on Shinso. But it had eventually gotten to a point where it was obvious that no one was coming to pick him up. Yamada had been standing with Aizawa, but eventually, he sat down next to his remaining student. Hey, have you heard anything from your parents? He asked. He didn't want to pry into family matters, but neglecting a kid after such a tragedy was distasteful. Shinso only shrugged and scratched the side of his head. He still had blood on him, but it was all dried by now. They're not coming. Could I just walk home? I'll be careful. Not coming? How could they? Yamada knew he had parents, his record said so. But neglectful? You know I can't let you do that. How about I give you a ride? He offered with a smile. Pro heroes were famous for fighting villains and stopping flashy crimes. But sometimes, this kind of hero work was the most important. Shinso looked to the teacher, surprised at the offer. Come on, it's getting late and I don't think you want to be driven home in a police cruiser. He patted his shoulder and gestured him along, Aizawa following behind. Yamada signed the papers to let him leave, had Shinso checked out to get a sample of blood off of him and then lead him to his car that was in the faculty parking lot. He opened the backseat door for him to in and shut it. Aizawa waited behind the car with his arms folded, his mind likely going a mile a minute. Yamada went up to him and put a hand on his shoulder, giving him a small nudge to ground him. The blood on the students, all the samples read back belonging to the people in the sudden disappearances case. Almost everyone was accounted for. Aizawa mumbled. The two looked back on the campus to see a few heroes beside a female hero crying in the grass. They recognized her as Earthly Venus, the Venus flytrap hero. Her younger sister had been added to the missing list quite some time ago. These villains, they're cruel. Aizawa gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. They defiled his student's corpse, putting it on display for all the other kids to see. They were teasing the heroes with the samples of blood. They had gotten into the school, maybe they were still there, or maybe they were waiting for another opportunity to nab a child. They were cruelly tormenting everyone. We'll get them, Yamada reassured. We can talk about this later. Let's take the kid home first. Aizawa watched Yamada take off the megaphone neckpiece and place it inside the trunk of the car and flexed his neck a bit. The typically loud hero then ran his fingers through his hair that was standing tall on his head a few times, bringing it down to become flatter and more natural. A few dramatic shakes of the head made it come down and become silky and straight in its natural state. He gave Aizawa a big smile, trying to keep the mood up as best he could, trying to be the light in this tragedy. The tired hero just sighed and turned away, getting into the passenger seat of the car. Yamada didn't hound him. Instead, he got into the driver's seat and looked back at Shinso with the same smile. "Where we going, Shinso?" The car ride was silent. Not even the radio was put on due to the risk of hearing any press on the incident. Shinso occasionally pointed and gave direction through the area, directing his teacher on where to go, to which he would always receive a smile and assurance as a response. He was such a cheerful man. It was amazing he was still so lighthearted after what had happened. Perhaps that's what made him so strong as a hero. His general presence brought relief. It made the purple-haired boy more comfortable in the car. Though the teenager sat in surprised silence when he saw his teacher's hand be gently placed on Aizawa's leg. He could be loud and passionate trying to hype up a room or a group of people. But he could do things quietly to bring out the best in people and bring them a different kind of solace. Shinso watched Aizawa place his hand over the others and lower his head into his scarf. The two seemed close at school, like best friends. But like this, they looked like something more. And it made him think. Why was Aizawa even in the car? Shinso was dropped off in a neighborhood just outside the city, a middle-class area. It wasn't too high-end and it wasn't in the slums either. But one didn't have to be rich or poor to be having a hard time at home. Shinso got out of the car and heard the window roll down on the driver's side. "If you need a ride again, just let me know, 'kay?" Yamada said loudly with a thumbs up. Shinso glanced away awkwardly before nodding subtly. "Yeah," and he walked up to the front door of his house and went inside. "You're too soft on your students," Aizawa muttered through his scarf. It sounded forced, like he was trying to insult him like he usually did. But Yamada knew full well that he meant something else. He didn't drive away just yet, and instead leaned over and planted a kiss on his forehead. "You are too sometimes," he retorted softly. They drove home together. They lived together. Yamada went to the trunk to take out the piece to his costume after handing Aizawa the keys to go inside. Something terrible happened, but life kept moving and things had to be done. They had to get out from their hero costumes, feed the several cats that they owned. Aizawa showered while Yamada was in the kitchen preparing a meal for the evening. The TV was turned on for background noise. It was like any other evening. They were both in lounge clothing by the end of the night. Yamada had his hair tied up in a half-assed bun and wore his normal glasses. This would normally be the time they used to grade any papers they didn't get to during the afternoon, but their bags were still sitting in the teacher's lounge where they left them. There was no going back for them until school was reinstated. So for this evening, Aizawa was laying down on the sofa with a calico on his chest and the TV on a news station, one arm draped over his eyes. But soon Yamada walked in and changed the channel to overly colorful game show and placed a bowl of pork tonkatsu on a coffee table for him. "Sorry, I'm not that hungry," Aizawa grumbled, mindlessly petting one of their cats. "I know. But you know that you should still eat something?" Yamada responded, sitting down on the floor, but he did not press further. Though they would stay like this for quite some time, eventually Yamada would pull out his phone, get up, and walk out of the room a few times. The last time he came back, he lifted Aizawa's legs and sat underneath them, keeping them on his lap. It wouldn't be long until another one of their cats found its way to his shoulder and began nipping at his glasses. This was fine. He didn't deserve it. Aizawa finally spoke on the matter. They had been home for a couple of hours now, and now he was finally willing to talk about it. He was a troublesome kid, mean to a few of his classmates. But he didn't deserve that. His voice was hushed, but Yamada heard him clearly and merely smiled peacefully while playing with the fabric of the pants on the legs on his lap. "No one deserves that," Yamada added. The tired teacher clenched the hand over his eyes into a fist. "I'm starting to think that the ones that did this deserve it." He was pissed. The faces of all the students, did you see how frightened they were? The students had run for their lives' sake. They were only met with explosions of blood from people who were likely dead. There was panic from not knowing if someone was outside waiting to attack them. Some resulted in just sitting down, fear-struck, and paralyzed. So many students were aiming to be heroes, and sights like that were inevitable. But to have it be done on purpose, to have a corpse displayed so cruelly. No child needed to see that. How do we convince them that they're safe after something like that? It was something they would never forget, surely. We just do what we can. We can't control everything, but we'll just have to protect what we have. Yamada answered. It was a simple answer, but it was all they could do. Then they were silent for a few minutes, though it was not an awkward silence. But Yamada did speak again. I'm joining Endeavor's team. Aizawa took his wrist off his eyes and looked to the other in shock. You're what? Endeavor was not trusted by either teacher. Ever since the suspicions around Todoroki and his home life emerged, the two had been very wary of him. Aizawa never appreciated the fame that he had and how the man was clawing to be number one. He wasn't betrayed by Yamada's action, but he was concerned. I don't trust him either. But he's the guy with all the information, all the records, all the investigations, and he has the police and a ton of other heroes at his fingertips. So I'm joining his team. Aizawa saw a narrowed look on the other's face. It was dark. And it was most certainly vengeful. The ones responsible for this won't be getting away with it. Yamada moved the legs on his lap off so he could stand up while also letting the cat biting his glasses down. I've got to go to bed. They want me at the police station to question some people that may be related to Kosuke Hiro's death tomorrow morning. I'm gonna be pretty busy from now on, he said, walking back to the master bedroom that they shared. He only made it halfway before Aizawa got up from the sofa quickly and chased after him. Hisashi, you didn't have to do that dash. Was he doing it for his sake? It wasn't his student that died. Why was he the one doing this? If you do it, it'll be too painful. Having a teacher on the inside would give the faculty more information to work with on how to protect our students. And the nerve of those villains really pisses me off. Yamada began to explain. Nizu would receive information dash. If we're judging Endeavor's character correctly, do you really think he'll tell Nizu everything? Nizu's smart and would probably be a powerful asset to have. But Endeavor wants all the credit, so he wants the guy with a ton of popularity on his team so he can get a bigger audience looking at him. Aizawa understood his reasoning now. Yamada wasn't stupid. Far from it. He may act like it, but he knew how to stay one step ahead of people sometimes. He wasn't messing around with this. Hisashi, he's just going to use you? The thought of that made Aizawa's stomach turn and heart ache. I'll be fine. I'm like really freaking strong, don't you know? I'm present, Mike, but the blonde hero only smiled. The next morning was different than most. What would be an early morning with Yamada annoyingly trying to get Aizawa to wake up for school was now the loud hero quietly getting up and trying not to wake the one sleeping next to him. He would usually put on his hero costume, stick up his hair, and hype himself up in the mirror to get his blood pumping for the day. But he walked past his costume, going into their closet and picked out a black suit and a bland colored tie, then combed his hair and tied front sections of it to the back in a bun. He went to the kitchen to fix himself a cup of coffee only to hear that he had been followed by the one he lived with. He looked back and saw Aizawa also in a suit with his hair tied back semi-formally. Shoyuta dash, Yamada quietly gasped. The tired man walked past him and went into the fridge for an energy drink. If you think you're doing this bit alone, you're wrong. He took a long chug of the bottle. Just this once. I need answers too. There was no argument to be had. Yamada just rolled his eyes and smirked. He walked past him to get to the door, but not without giving his but a light slap because that was the true gay agenda of this household. You're lucky you're hot as hell in a suit, he teased and made the tired hero's face go red but also appear very annoyed. They shared a kiss before walking out the door together. Now is not the time for this. Pick up. The second they walked into the police station, it was like opening an oven that had been baking a cake for an hour. The heat was so intense that it made both men close their eyes and pause as a small wind forced their hair to blow slightly. The cake in the oven was just a man with a bad attitude. Endeavor was on the phone and looked more pissed off than usual, his fist on the desk in front of him with a few officers hiding down behind it to keep from getting their faces melted off. After a few seconds, The flame hero lit up again and slammed his phone down on the tabletop. Isn't it too early to be this rageful? Aizawa grumbled. This is what Yamada was in for? It was literally going to be hell with this room temperature. Endeavor turned to the two that walked in, one looking exhausted and the other smiling like a ray of sunshine. Mornin', fire face. Yamada was not going through this as easily as the flame hero would like. The bigger man scowled at both of them, frustrated at whoever he was trying to call. Everyone knew exactly who he was trying to get a hold of. I can't get Shudo to pick up his phone. He left the campus yesterday evening with a woman named Midoriya Inko without telling me. And now he's refusing to answer my texts and calls. He was supposed to be here an hour ago. He looked down at his phone and saw another read pop up under another one of his texts, but there was no sign of a reply being written. He's not gonna answer you with that attitude, Yamada teased with some finger guns. He looked formal in a suit, but even that wasn't enough to make him mature through all of this. He was gonna make this number 2 hero suffer every second with him. Seeing him like this brought a bit of relief to Aizawa. Hizashi's Hizashi no matter what. What's that supposed to mean? I'm his father. Endeavor shouted. The tired hero sighed and held his hand out, gesturing for Endeavor's phone. Begrudgingly, it was handed over and it felt like the device was overheating. 52 attempted calls and 24 texts. How obsessive. But Aizawa looked for Todoroki's number in his contacts before taking out his own phone to call it and turning his back to Endeavor, making the bigger man feel incredibly offended. The phone rang a few times and then there was a faint hello heard. Endeavor was going to yell and snatch the phone when Yamada popped up beside him and covered his mouth fearlessly and held his wrist back as best he could. The cowering police officers were terrified for this daring man's life. Somewhere across town, Midoriya and Todoroki were taking their sweet time at a cafe, drinking black coffee and sweetened iced coffee, and had Zuzu on a leash with a bit of ice cream remains on her nose. Todoroki would rather answer an unknown number than his father's, and Midoriya found it kind of funny. Hello. Todoroki. It's Mr. Aizawa. Mr. Aizawa? Why aren't you at the police station? Weren't you supposed to be here a while ago? We didn't want to go. And I'd rather not see Endeavor, so we went to a cafe instead. Endeavor was fuming at the sound of their conversation. Yamada smiled softly when he heard Todoroki say Tsui. He knew exactly who he was with. And he even heard that very voice faintly in the background as Midoriya clung on to Todoroki's neck from behind and giggled. We should go do something fun like an arcade or something? Aizawa put his hand over his face and sighed. Teenagers. Could you please come? We don't want to send someone out to force you here. It'll only be less than an hour. Present Mike and I could interview you both too. There was no other way to convince them. If Endeavor was going to interrogate them, they'd never say a thing. When they were apart, they were diligent and well-behaved students. But together they seemed to become troublemakers. There was silence on the line for a few moments before an answer. As long as it's not Endeavor, we'll head there now. Endeavor lit up again but swiped his own phone back from Aizawa before stomping off. He had such a dreadful temper. Todoroki was usually very calm and collected. It was hard to see any shared personality traits. And Todoroki, one more thing, now that he had a moment on the phone with him without being watched. Save this number, okay? You can call it any time you need to, he said, looking back at the angry hero stomping off. There was such a long pause on the other end, he thought Todoroki had hung up. To do dash, but he was still there. Yeah, you should. Thank you. And then there was a sudden click. He hung up, but so abruptly? Maybe it was something else. In the meantime, Aizawa and Yamada were taken to a room in the police station where several detectives and heroes were, and they all went over the details of the sudden disappearances case and the bloody tragedy at UA. Information on Kosuke Hiro's death was given out. Details of crime scenes, times of disappearances, areas of disappearances, potential subjects, potential victims and demographics. All that there was to know was explained. And yet, there wasn't much. They had names and dates and trends. All the potential suspects were mostly those that were last to see victims alive or those that had personal vendettas. People had enemies. But there was not a single person that was connected to all the victims. Aizawa could hardly wrap his head around it all. something that had been going on for months now, and this was all they had? But Yamada listened carefully, even taking stacks of papers and looking through them during the briefing. "I'll find the commonality," he muttered. Even though well-trained detectives were having difficulty, the Scream hero was stepping up to the challenge to protect his students. After the briefing, it became open floor and discussion amongst the adults in the room. Aizawa had sat down and held his head in his palm with his elbow on the armrest of the chair. And here he hoped teaching would keep him out of tragedies like this. It felt like being stared at in every direction in complete darkness. Overwhelmed. His past mistakes coming to haunt him. Logically, he knew that the true one to blame was the killer themselves. But he couldn't help but feel that maybe there was a way to prevent it. He was hard on his students. Maybe he shouldn't have been so quick to kick Kosuke out. Maybe he should have stepped in sooner to stop his and Todoroki's fight from ever happening. Were all his students in danger now? Were they being targeted? From where? Why them? They were only children. What could he do? Where could he find the threat? How could prevent something like this from happening again? Why did kids need to die this way? Shirakumo, what do I do? What could he do? It was soon that Yamada appeared in front of him and began tugging at his wrist. They weren't summoned anywhere and nothing important was happening, it just seemed like he wanted to take him somewhere. And thus the blonde hero pulled him out of the chair and then out the room. He pulled him around the corner to an empty hallway and carefully pushed him back against the wall. It was quiet. They were alone here. "If this is going to mess with you so bad, you should go home," Yamada said sternly, but not in a mean way. "I know this has you thinking of bad memories and it's only going to get worse from here. It's not that I don't think you can handle it. But I know that this is going to tear you up the deeper you go." He was worried and he was making that clear. There was nothing to hide, no secrets here. Aizawa just kept his head low enough for his eyes to be almost out of view. On the outside, he appeared merely calm and frustrated. But his mind was on the edge with paranoia, like someone was pulling the strings on his mental stability, making him dance in fear and wonder when the next innocent child would die. The villain was playing with him, knowing he would never be quick enough to know where the blood trail was leading. I can't just dash," Yamada put his hand against the wall beside his head harshly to make a loud sound. "You're going to go insane. And you need to stay sane for the kids. I'm not stronger than you with this kind of stuff, but Kosuke was not my student. I didn't know him and I didn't see what was happening. You saw everything and now you're over-analyzing with all your witty logic. Don't push yourself to do this." Aizawa shook his head slowly. "I can't watch another one die. It'll be more painful than all of this. If another one of my students go missing this conversation could have continued for a while, but Aizawa's phone vibrated. There were 2 messages. One that was just sent, and one that was sent a few minutes ago, both from Todoroki. "We're here, and where are you, fish?" Aizawa must have been too deep in thought earlier and didn't hear his phone go off the first time. He promised Todoroki that they'd interview him. But if Endeavor got word that he arrived, and it was very likely that he did, we gotta run. The 2 teachers quit their private conversation, knowing full well where their priorities were, and sprinted down the halls. It was almost like watching 2 teenagers running away from getting caught skipping class. In suits and all, they were able to bolt and turn corners, skidding to make the hard turns. There was a point that they accidentally bumped into a police officer that was holding a bunch of papers and made him drop nearly everything he was holding. "Shit. Sorry." Yamada called back, but they didn't stop and they weren't going to. Endeavor was bound to be on his way to the interrogation rooms and they couldn't let him get there first. And the flame hero was casually walking to the room that Midoriya and Todoroki were waiting in. He was in no hurry and taking his time, looking through a packet of paper in his hands carefully. And thus he was not expecting the 2 other heroes to be in such a chaotic rush. They turned a corner almost a little too quickly as Aizawa was able to stop himself but had to grab Yamada's hand to stop him from sliding too far. He used the momentum of the sliding to swing him down the hall and give him a head start. Yamada ran ahead and reached the door to the waiting room just as Endeavor was turning the corner beside the door. He swung it open so hard and carelessly, he didn't notice how hard he hit the larger hero in the face and focused more on his companions sprinting inside. Todoroki and Midoriya were sitting beside each other, Zuzu in Todoroki's lap as they were both looking at the little villain's phone screen together. Aizawa grabbed Todoroki's upper arm in a hurry and pulled him along. "You're with me," he said, looking back at Yamada shutting the door and joining him. Endeavor was stunned at the door having been hit so hard that it took him a moment to process what just hit him. The blonde hero walked beside the teacher and student and glanced back at Midoriya with a big smile and finger guns. "You'll be next." The door was locked and all the lights were left on and bright. Yamada and Aizawa sat down on the same side of the singular table in the middle of the small room with deep exhales. They were exhausted from their childish run. Todoroki sat on the opposite side of the table with Zuzu sitting on his lap, looking dumbfounded by the teachers before him. "You guys okay?" It took a few moments for them to catch their breath and Yamada just chuckled, waving his hand. "We just got your texts. We didn't want to keep you waiting," the loud hero said with a heavy breath. Endeavor was probably sitting in the waiting room with Midoriya this very second. How big of a problem was that? "So let's start, shall we?" Yamada tried to keep the mood positive and comfortable as long as he could. It was inevitable that it wouldn't last. The atmosphere immediately became more delicate, quieter. The air felt heavier in pressure. There was no controlling it. Things just had to be talked about. "For credibility's sake, this is going to be recorded. Answer as best you can. We're not asking for anything more," Aizawa explained as he placed a small device with a microphone on the desk beside a few papers and a pen. Todoroki nodded as his puppy shifted to lay down on his lap and nuzzled into his shirt. "It's okay to take your time answering." Aizawa watched Todoroki look off and away at the floor. These weren't going to be fun questions. Aizawa looked down at the papers and covered his eyes with his hand. The first question was just cruel. "Do you hold a grudge against Kosuke Hiro?" It sounded painful just to ask that. "I know you both had your differences. I was told he said some awful things to you and was a regular harasser. You both got into a fight just before he went missing." It was a question that had every right to be answered, but it was cruel nonetheless. "I do." And Todoroki answered truthfully. "He hurt my dash they were recording. Friend. He gave him a scar on his eye and burned him. I was angry and I still hate him for it. Could he ever forgive him? Maybe if he had a better influence. Did you want something bad to happen to him? Not death. Do you know anyone who would want his death? No. What about your friend? Was he angry too?" "He was. But he wouldn't do that. There's no way he could." Midoriya was too kind from his perspective. There's no way his beloved boyfriend would go so far as to kill someone. He was studying to be a doctor. Doctors save people. Kosuke's parents called the police Saturday evening to report that he had not returned home. Where were you Saturday? Why wasn't there a massive search for him right away? Were the police really that adamant in order to prevent panic? "I was with Midoriya." Todoroki began petting Zuzu, remembering that weekend he spent with his boyfriend. "We went to an aquarium in the morning. I snuck out of the house because Endeavor wouldn't let me go. But then Midoriya started feeling sick and I tried to take him somewhere to eat so he wouldn't pass out. He caught us and got really mad, but Midoriya's older brother came and picked him up before we both got in trouble. Midoriya's records say he's an only child," Yamada said, looking over a paper without his glasses. It was a profile on the little villain. He has an older brother figure that he lives with. When I was brought back home I left again and stayed the night with them. And then again the day after. We went to the biggest mall in the city together that day and we even saw Bakugo there. There would be proof of them going everywhere Todoroki claimed they went to. There was no time in the timeline for Midoriya to kidnap and kill Kosuke in those 2 days, not without help. It was a team effort. But they didn't know that. The people that he lived with sounded very hospitable and charitable coming from the half and half boy. "Am I allowed to ask how he died?" Todoroki questioned. A gruesome curiosity, but it was inevitable. The two teachers looked at each other, unsure. But Aizawa answered anyhow. He was stabbed several times and his lungs, throat, and mouth were severely burned. So he struggled? That is likely. How long was he in the ceiling? We think a villain snuck in during the alarm at the beginning of the week and planted it there because there's no cameras. The cafeteria would have masked the smell for a while until it became too overpowering. Todoroki was petting Zuzu until he moved his fingers in front of her nose to receive a few puppy kisses. He looked down at her and seemed a bit concerned. Does anyone think we did it? Was a single fight enough to make him and Midoriya main suspects? They snuck out a lot, they were living with people that weren't real family, they lied to their parents often. Were they suspicious enough to actually be blamed for this? No one in their right mind. Being a teenager and having a hard time with another student is not enough to label you two as possible killers. I find it hard to believe that any working here were perfect in high school and got along with everyone. Yamada chimed in, trying to flip Todoroki's frown around. I heard even your father was a bit troublesome back in his day, he giggled. And that was when Aizawa reached on the table to shut off the recorder, but when Todoroki went to stand up, he held his hand up to tell him to stay seated. He wasn't done. But why did he shut off the mic? Even Yamada looked baffled. Todoroki, why do you sneak out? Endeavor has complained that you've been running away from home very often ever since school started. Yamada realized at that moment Aizawa's true intentions of coming to the police station and interviewing Todoroki. He was trying to prevent another tragedy. He had this private moment with his student. The recording and cameras were off. Endeavor was out the door, down a short hall, and in the waiting room. They had all the time they needed to talk. But Todoroki appeared to tense. Zuzu stood up on his lap, putting her paws on his chest and kissed his cheek. I prefer being with my friend. He preferred being with Midoriya. Was that all? It couldn't be. Aizawa pried more. Endeavor has a bad temper, it's not a secret. Does he get angry at you often? Mr. Aizawa, is this part of the inter-dash? It's not. I'm asking as your teacher and nothing more. Todoroki took Zuzu by her torso to pull her down, but she continued to rub up against him. She wasn't a certified therapy dog, just some stray he found on the street. But she was good at detecting anxiety in her owner. The room was becoming a bit cold. He does, but he's been like that forever. I'm used to dash, he shouldn't be used to it. Does he yell at you? Aizawa's eyes narrowed. This semester, a dead student and an abused student. Why was this semester that was going wrong? He couldn't save the one that was killed, but maybe, just maybe he could save this one. We argue. It happens. Sometimes it's worse than others. His answers are so short and vague. He's avoiding the obvious truth. Just tell me. Tell me so I can save you. So he yells at you? Todoroki, does he hit you? Aizawa's face, usually so tired, bored, annoyed, frustrated, was now so desperate to hear the truth. The truth was in his reach, he just needed the verbal evidence that it was there. But it was because of that, Todoroki didn't see his teacher. He saw his mother, hurt and broken once again. He couldn't do it. Aizawa needed to focus on finding Kosuke's killer, not solving his family drama. It wasn't his home. It wasn't his business. No, Todoroki didn't look him in the eyes, only down at the puppy on his lap. Let me keep Zuzu. Everything's fine. Besides, someone else was already looking out for him. He didn't need Aizawa. The look of disappointment in his teacher's face was depressing to look at. He failed again. The day had to move forward. It wouldn't stop for this. Todoroki was escorted back to the waiting room where a few more people were sitting in now. It had been just Midoriya when they left, but now it included Endeavor and All Might in his fake form. All Might was also in a suit like everyone else, also being a player in the investigation now. But why was he here for the interrogations? The little villain had been sitting in silence as it was too awkward to start a conversation with either of the two men in the room. So he didn't ask anything, though glaring was a different story. He looked relieved when Todoroki was brought back in with Zuzu. He smiled at him and patted the seat next to him cheerfully. How he wanted to kiss him, but wouldn't with this audience. Though he watched the two teachers whisper to each other and then saw Yamada happily sit down on the other side of Todoroki. Zuzu's her name, right? She's adorable. Is she a Shiba? Small talk? Midoriya Izuku, you'll be with just me, Aizawa called out before Midoriya could question anything. Yamada was left behind to keep an eye on Todoroki, to make sure Endeavor didn't become too aggressive around him. With this in mind, the little villain felt comfortable leaving with the eraser hero. When the two walked down the short hall together, the faint minty glow began to appear in the boy's eyes again, ready to make amusement for himself in this. The very one this hero was searching for was standing right beside him with an innocent smile. The door was locked. They sat down on opposite ends of the table and the recording device and mic were turned on. Recordings? You guys aren't playing around, Midoriya said cheerfully like there wasn't a problem in the world. Aizawa only glared. Both the boys' personalities surrounding the bloody tragedy could not be any more different. This is about the fight, right? Yeah, I was really pissed at the guy for bothering Todoroki every day, but I wouldn't kill him. Yes, he would. I mean, he was so much stronger than me. His nails were enough to literally scar me. He tied him down and used dangerous drugs to weaken him. With all the people that went missing, do you really think Todoroki and I could do that? He was coming up with alibis before the questions even began. He was prepared. He was confident. Some of the people that went missing disappeared in the middle of the day while we're at school. He was smiling the whole time he was talking, making many gestures with his hands casually. Aizawa looked down at the papers on the desk where questions had been written down, but from how this was starting, they would all be useless. He pushed them aside and folded his arms, leaning back in his chair. What was your first reaction when Kosuke Hiro's body fell from the ceiling? You were nearby, weren't you? There was a glimmer in the boy's eyes. A challenge. A hero and a killer were face to face with just a desk in between. They both knew who they were talking to. Terrified. Did you see how messed up that thing looked? Its jaw was falling off and it was covered in bugs. Midoriya smirked. His face didn't match what he was saying. This was so much fun. Why didn't you run away like everyone else? Amongst the fleeing students, one was unafraid and fully aware of everything. That one didn't run or fear. Todoroki was still there. I couldn't just leave him. He would never leave him while he was so broken. Not like All Might. He would never be like All Might. You say you were scared, but you were so relaxed when we found you. Explain that. Midoriya rested his cheek in his palm and hummed. Todoroki was so out of it. I had to be strong for him. Last I remember, you and Mr. Yamada couldn't even get him to blink. Was it because you both were frightened too? It was pretty easy to tell honestly. The villain mocked the hero and lowered his head with a smug look as he leaned back in his chair with folded arms as well. Aren't heroes supposed to be brave? You were shaking in your boots when you first saw the body and no one tried to help Todoroki or even Kaken and the redhead. He saw that. He had been watching everyone the moment they entered and left the presence of the corpse. Not a single student tried to help Todoroki, Bakugo, or Kirishima. Heroes are people too. They feel fear just like everyone else. Aizawa growled. Midoriya tapped his cheek with his finger, smugly grinning. It appears that you understand your place as a hero, as a human. But I don't believe many are like you. They compare themselves too much to idols if you ask me, he chuckled. You have feelings and memories that are real, you just don't let them show until they're ripped out of you. It was so funny to watch him mentally crumble, how Yamada had to cling on to him to keep him from breaking when the body fell. Seeing Kosuke like that? You've seen something similar before, haven't you? Aizawa gritted his teeth as it took much of his strength not to harm the boy before him. Especially when Midoriya leaned forward with his arms stretched out straight, hand over hand with a two-faced smile. Do you want to talk about it, Eraserhead? I want to see you fall apart. Aizawa slammed his hand on the desk, making Midoriya blink a few times and sit back normally in his chair. That's enough. He breathed sharply. This boy was cruel. His adorable glowing eyes were mocking him. His smile was like needles in his back. His hand gestures were like puppeteering, playing with the emotions and the lives of everyone around him. With gritted teeth and so much hate in his eyes, Aizawa proceeded with rapid-fire questions. Kosuke Hiro disappeared Saturday afternoon. Where were you? With Todoroki at an aquarium, and then my big brother had to pick me up because I felt sick. What happened after? I helped Todoroki sneak out of his house again and had him spend the night twice in a row. What did you do the next day? We spent most of the day at the mall. We bought him clothes to leave at my dad's place. Their stories matched up. Midoriya answered quickly and cleanly without hesitation. Who are these people that you live with? Then the little villain paused. Why was Aizawa asking this? How suspicious was he? How much was he assuming? My big brother is a deadbeat hermit who plays video games all day, but he introduced me to the basics of medical education. My dad is a bartender at a backstreet bar. That was as honest as he was going to get. He watched Aizawa reach over and turn the recording device off. Has Todoroki been staying with you often? Yeah. He likes it there with me. Is he hiding from Endeavor? That's none of your business. With that statement, the tired teacher was able to put something together in his head. The sudden hang-up of his phone call with Todoroki earlier. Why does he need a guy who can't protect anyone when he has me? Midoriya forced him to hang up. He was building walls around his beloved hero, taking him away at lunch to be alone together, blocking out his classmates, taking him away from home, giving a safe place to become attached to. He was tarnishing his faith in heroes. He was making him completely dependent, undeniably loyal, unquestionably obedient. A broken boy on strings wrapped around his fingertips. Aizawa stood up from his seat with both his hands on the table. We're done here. But stay put for just a minute, he said sternly. Midoriya never stopped smiling. He closed his eyes with a short giggle to show he understood. The eraser hero walked out of the interrogation room and was met by All Might in his weakened form just behind the door. You told me you knew him in middle school. Is he different or not? The walls to the interrogation room were soundproof thankfully, so Midoriya did not hear him snap at the #1 hero. All Might had a drop of sweat come down the side of his head as he rubbed the back of his neck. I only met him for a few minutes. But he was nothing like this. All Might had recognized the little villain since the first day he saw him at UA. He chose to never speak to him openly on what happened that fateful day on the skyscraper rooftop, and he trusted him with the secret of his fake form. But the boy he saved from the slime villain that afternoon was not the same as the one sitting at that desk. The window on the door of the interrogation room was tinted so that those inside could not see out, but those on the outside could see in. Both heroes looked to the window to see the little villain with glowing, mischievous eyes looking in their direction with the sweetest of smiles. He wasn't like this at all, All Might repeated quietly. Something's not right about him. He's nothing but bad news, Aizawa said through gritted teeth. Midoriya was walked back to the waiting room by Aizawa with a big smile on his face. All Might stayed back in the hall watching them leave and received a look back by the little villain. His cold stare was nothing like the sparkling eyes back in middle school when he found him. A starstruck fanboy had become such a hateful and bitter thing. And yet when he was brought back to the waiting room, his face showed nothing but joy and sunshine as he jumped back in his seat beside Todoroki. He gripped the edge of his seat and leaned forward enthusiastically. Let's go do something fun now. They did their part so they could leave now, right? Endeavor glared at the two from across the room. This was the third time he had seen Midoriya. The first time being when Todoroki was suspended, and the second was when he was caught sneaking out. So this was the boy that was getting him into the trouble. The bad influence. Are we allowed to leave? Todoroki asked, turning to Yamada. The students looked to the teacher and their faces could comically be compared to Zuzu's with subtle puppy dog eyes. He was a sucker for them. Go have fun. He dismissed them happily. That's not your permission to GI-. Endeavor spoke up, but halfway through speaking Midoriya took Todoroki's hand and rushed out the door with Zuzu bouncing behind. Don't ignore me, he shouted when they stepped foot out the door. He earned a glance from them and they stopped. However, it was only for a moment so Midoriya could pull the skin down from his scarred eye and stick his tongue out mockingly. Endeavor's face lit up with flames as the two made a run for it down the hall with the puppy and left Yamada covering his mouth to keep in laughter. Endeavor would chase after them, but there was still work to do here at the police station. Midoriya, Todoroki, and Zuzu hurried down the hall to get to the entrance, not even caring to notice the two characters they went past. And those two characters walked to the waiting room door and opened it. They both looked so tired with slight bags and darkness under their eyes. Bakugo and Kirishima were not as quick to recover from what they had seen that day. School was cancelled for days. Cleanup and sterilization was done and redone again to make extra sure that there was no trace of the bloody tragedy. The ceiling was repaired and sensors were implemented in all the ducts and vents to strengthen security. More cameras were set up around campus and the main gate was reinstated to be stronger than the last. Emergency exits were made more plentiful. UA was completely refortified for the safety of all the students. News stations were almost nothing but Principal Nizu speaking to the public on the incident in a conference where he strongly convinced the public that the school was still safe and would resume classes promptly and provide counseling for students that needed it. The city was buzzing with paranoia and distrust. Who was behind the murder? Surely it had to be someone on the inside. Was it a teacher? It couldn't possibly be a student. Could a hero have gone rogue? The tragedy was an incident that made headlines and had everyone on edge. Endeavor's agency and the heroes that joined his team were working hard, extended hours and under pressure. To the point where Endeavor did not have time to blow up Todoroki's phone or hunt him down to bring him home. There would be no point because he didn't have time to train with him. Though it bothered him whenever he thought about often he was sneaking out and how the periods he was gone were getting longer. It used to be just staying after school for an hour or two. Then it was on the weekends for a few hours. Then it was turning into staying overnight. It had become full days he'd be gone. How did he let this happen? While the area was on the borderline of panic, two teenagers still managed to have their fun. Coffee shops and sweet shops, parks and arcades, manga reading and binge watching, and all the time together they could ask for. The time off the school gave for mental rehabilitation and coping, as well as grieving and investigation. Two teenagers were using it as a little vacation. With a stolen piece of plastic from Endeavor's wallet, they had the power to do whatever they wanted. And Todoroki was a very tired boy with very limited energy in his system. He would go to bed fairly early every night, thus giving Midoriya time to train his physical capabilities with Shigaraki. It was a lovely time for preparation. The first day returning to UA was far different than the school days that had come before. The air was heavy with grief and tension. A villain had penetrated their sanctuary of education, and now it felt that nowhere was safe, nowhere was private. A killer walked amongst them. Some had their suspicions of a traitor, but many pushed it aside to preserve peace of mind. If word got out of a traitor, it would be a free-for-all. And yet Midoriya was able to walk through the newly reinforced gates without any care. Reporters were bordering the path as a few heroes and police officers held them back from troubling any of the students. Of course, they would want the latest on a murder that happened in relation to UA. It was the story of the year, an unforgettable bloody tragedy. Todoroki and Midoriya parted ways for class after short and sweet goodbyes. Class 1A had been one of the most eager classes, full of potential, pride, and high hopes. And now that class sat mostly sullen at their desks in silence. There was no morning chatter or roaming around the room. Even Bakugo sat normally at his seat with his head resting on his arms on the tabletop. Everyone's eyes had wandered to Kosuke's desk behind him at least once or twice. There was a picture in a frame with a few flowers placed around it in respect. Perhaps time away was not long enough to grieve and to come to terms with an undealt with threat. The students would have rather stayed home to remind themselves that they and their families were safe. And yet Todoroki only wished the time away was longer so he could have done more with Midoriya. He sat down at his desk without an expression to be read. "Good morning, Todoroki. Or, at least as good as it can be. Are you doing okay?" Yaoyorozu would always greet him kindly in the morning. She was nice like that. He always appreciated it. But he could see that her eyes were a bit shinier than usual. She was so empathetic. "Are you okay?" Todoroki asked back, watching a small tear start to drip down her cheek. She turned away and was quick to wipe her face and waved her hand down. "I'm fine, really. Just, everyone is so sad." They spoke quietly to not disrupt the room's near silence. "We were all worried about you," she added, turning back to face him. Kosuke had been so mean to him, and he was the closest to his corpse. He had become so limp and lifeless at the time of the incident, and everyone saw that. "I'm okay," Todoroki assured with a small nod. He was okay. He was more than okay. Some of his pain had finally been taken away. Midoriya made his way to his homeroom and found it to be quieter than normal, but nowhere near as silent as 1A. He sat at his desk and merely took out his school notebook to doodle mindlessly while waiting for Yamada to show up. But he was suddenly snapped out of his hazy thoughts when someone sat at the desk in front of him but sat backwards with his arms on the backrest. "No one's really talking about it," Shinso muttered, looking at the rest of their classmates, watching them. Pretend like nothing happened. This was the first time Midoriya would have a full conversation with Shinso, face to scarred face. It's probably out of respect. But there'll be gossip soon enough. The little villain sighed, looking up from his drawings. Yeah, Shinso agreed. Then they proceeded to sit in silence for a few awkward moments with Midoriya continuing to doodle. Neither of them were exactly experts on making friends and having a casual conversation with each other. They hardly knew anything about each other at all. And yet they had always been friendly with each other. Do you think someone on the inside did it? Shinso asked, making Midoriya's hand twitch. What? Midoriya asked, looking up again. He looked afraid, but it was easily mistaken for a look of fear of a threat rather than the fear of being found out so soon. He knew Aizawa had his suspicions, but there was nothing a teacher could do against a student, especially one who was likely paranoid from trauma. He wasn't credible. But another student on the other hand, do you think someone here at this school did it? Shinso was stone-faced and it was difficult to read him. His tired eyes and monotone voice made him impossible to encrypt. What makes you think that? Midoriya asked back with a nervous smile. This is a hero school. We all want to save people. There's no one to suspect. We're innocent teenagers. Victims. I'm innocent. I think I noticed it when the blood started blowing up everywhere. Shinso began casually, looking up at the ceiling. Was there anyone up there now? He could only wonder. The body fell during the lunch rush and it fell almost naturally. But I think it was time to fall during then, like something was placed underneath it on the tiles to make the ceiling break faster but make it look like it was natural. And blood started going off as soon as people started running. Like someone was watching and waiting for the perfect moment to scare us. Midoriya still smiled, but behind that smile, he wanted to scream. How could he figure that out by himself? He was sure this would make it look like an attack from the outside. Maybe there were secret cameras placed by the villains or something. He tried to debate. There weren't. The police didn't say anything about that. I stayed so late that night that a lot of the authorities left. All I had to listen to were their reports. He knew almost as much as the police did. But that doesn't mean dash. No one liked Kosuke Hiro. He was a bully and pretty much an asshole. Shinso cut him off unintentionally, but he had a point to make. His quirk wasn't anything special and he lived in one of the poorest sections of the city. His family has a clean background. He may be a part of the sudden disappearances, but he's the only one who's been found and confirmed dead, the only minor, and the only one who didn't have some sketchy underground life or a hero license. Someone went after him personally, I think. Shinso scratched the side of his head and looked out the window, not noticing how he was explaining his theory to the very killer he was trying to weed out. It's just an educated guess, logical reasoning. Midoriya was nearly stunned with his hand quivering as he held a pencil. Shinso knew Kosuke was more than special. His corpse wasn't just a sign to represent a looming terror. It was spite. Do you really think that someone here is capable of that? Midoriya asked, still faking a smile, but his tone of voice was betraying him. Not a teacher, there's no one new here, and I don't think anyone besides All Might and Mr. Aizawa had ties to him. And he saw for himself how broken up Aizawa was, despite it being very minimal signs. So you think it's a student? Shinso nodded in confirmation. But then he half smirked. It can't be you though. You're too kind. That's why I'm telling you all of this. He had Shinso's trust. Midoriya's slight quivering stopped as he closed his eyes in his smile. They opened slightly again when he spoke, letting a little mint light emit from them. It's nice to know that someone so quick-witted trusts me, he hummed, and it made the purple-haired boy blush ever so subtly. Someone so smart with such a manipulative quirk, what a dream it would be to coax him over to Shigaraki's side. He could play along like this and try to lure him closer, like persuading a cat to jump into his arms from a tree. We could solve this together. Just you and me. Midoriya giggled. The remainder of the day proceeded almost as normally as it would any other. Training, note-taking, academics, and all the works. There was no lunch rush that day, however. Classes were let out one at a time to walk to the cafeteria to avoid overcrowding, and the period was extended so there would be plenty of time for everyone to enjoy their meals. The ceiling had been redone as had the flooring. Emergency exits were made bigger. A lesson had been learned. But that did not stop Midoriya and Todoroki from avoiding the cafeteria altogether and still going outside to sit under a tree in the courtyard. The same tree they sat under during the evacuation. They still preferred it that way. They talked and enjoyed each other's company as they always had. It was like nothing even happened. Midoriya had accidentally spent a little too long in Recovery Girl's office that afternoon when the bell rang and was scrambling to put all of his things into his bag. How embarrassing! They were going to miss the train to the mall if he didn't hurry. He sloppily shoved everything in and didn't even zip his bag all the way when he bolted out of the room. He sprinted right past the teacher's lounge where Aizawa was also packing his things and noticed him. He then turned to look out the window and expected to see Todoroki at the front gates waiting for the little villain. But his eyes narrowed at something else. "Why did you come here?" Todoroki glared up at the man that was standing in front of him at the gate. Endeavor had come here to take him home personally. Any plans were cancelled. "Never mind. I don't care. I have to get going." Todoroki tried to walk past him but Endeavor sidestepped to block his path, making the boy narrow his eyes at him. "Going where? Where have you been going, Shudo? You've been gone almost an entire week." The time the school gave for students to grieve included the day after the tragedy, the weekend, and a few more days after that. Todoroki had not been home with Zuzu in quite some time and Endeavor had had enough. "That's none of your busi." He tried to walk past him again only to be pushed back. "It is my business. You've been staying with that boy, haven't you?" It was obvious to everyone where he's been staying. He couldn't hide it for much longer. Todoroki didn't want to answer. His lie would easily be seen through. The truth would lead to even more questions. To stay silent made his guilt clear. Endeavor only scowled and took hold of his son's arm. "Don't make me do this again, Shudo. We're going home. Just come with me this time." His grip wasn't tight, but it was strong and threatening to become stronger. They were on campus property. There were cameras. It was suddenly that Todoroki's other arm was latched onto by a whole body weight. Midoriya clung to him as tight as he could while trying to pull him away. He wasn't going to let Endeavor just take him again. He could never take him away. "He's mine now. You can't take him away." Midoriya cried out, holding as best he could. He could never win in a tug-of-war like this, but he could at least try. "Shudo doesn't want to go with you. Why can't you see that?" Everyone has been railroading Todoroki to stay away from his father. Even Aizawa and Yamada have gone out of their way to make sure that he wasn't alone with him. If they lost him tonight, it would be the first time they'd have a one-on-one since the tragedy. It would not end well. Not with how poor Todoroki's relationship was with Kosuka. "Shudo, is that true?" Endeavor asked, his voice much lower than it had been before. Todoroki tried shaking Midoriya off, wanting him to just get away from this. It wouldn't be safe for him. "It is. And nothing you do is going to change that." That wasn't the answer the number 2 hero wanted to hear. "You'd rather miss on all the valuable training that many would give anything to have, just to go slack off with this child? Are you hearing yourself? You're far above him, he's nothing compared to you, you're going to rise above them all." The arm Endeavor held started to get hot and it made the man smirk. He hadn't seen his fire in years and it was starting to come out. "Don't call him that," Todoroki snapped lowly. Those words meant nothing to Midoriya coming from Endeavor. But he knew Todoroki wouldn't take insults thrown at him like that. The little villain clung tighter and tried to pull him back. There was no way he'd win this fight. There was no way they'd win this fight. "He'll never be anything like you. You'll never control him either." "Just leave." Midoriya cried but then felt Todoroki be tugged forward but he still held on. It was then that the little villain felt himself be pried off by a massive hand and tossed back a few paces. The strength and size of the pro hero was formidable. And yet the little villain was about to latch on again when he blocked off by sheer heat coming from the hero's free hand. "Don't touch him again." Endeavor began when Todoroki's ice rose up from the ground around Midoriya with frost coating part of the taller student's cheek. "Touch him and I'll." Todoroki was about to threaten him. But someone suddenly appeared between the two and Midoriya as a means of protecting the freckled boy from any harm with his arms folded. The freckled doctor first noticed the yellow striped dress pants that matched a blazer. All Might stood before them in his fake form and with a big smile on his face. Endeavor. Surely the firm hand of parenting is not needed to take Todoroki home. And Todoroki, why not try to see these things from your father's perspective? He's only worried about you. He advised as if it would be able to fix the situation he was trying to ease. It was likely his words did nothing, but his presence died down their flames and ice. Endeavor did not let go and Todoroki looked as pissed off as ever. Almost as much as Midoriya. Midoriya's hands twitched at his sides as his jaw clenched tight. How dare he? How dare he butt in like this, like he knew what was going on? How dare he feel like he was calming the situation? How dare he try to protect him? How dare he try to fix something that can't be fixed? He was making it worse. He was letting Todoroki get taken away. Funny how you're giving parental advice when you're not even a parent, Midoriya muttered darkly. All Might noticed the look on the boy's face from over his shoulder but merely took it as childish pouting because he wasn't letting him leave with Todoroki as he wanted. True. But sometimes these things just take understanding. Sometimes these things just take murder. Kosuke was a great example of that. And he's right. Perhaps I just lost my temper. Endeavor admitted, but it was a lie to appease the number one hero. Using him to get his way. It's more like your personality, Todoroki said under his breath bitterly. A rebellious teenager, that's all he was, wasn't it? Just upset that he couldn't go hang out with his friend. We should be going now. We have yet to talk about what happened here, Endeavor said, lightly tugging his son to follow. How desperately Todoroki wanted to reach out to Midoriya and go with him instead. But to keep him from harm and getting in trouble, he reluctantly followed and looked back at him longingly. They couldn't even pretend to love each other with either of the two pros around. This left Midoriya and All Might alone at the front gates. And the freckled boy appeared as angry as ever. That wasn't your place, you know. You don't know anything about what happens at that house, he growled. This was finally a chance to give him a piece of his mind since that day. Did All Might even remember him? Or was he just pretending to be on friendly terms with him? I know you have your suspicions. Mr. Aizawa and Mr. Yamada do too. But I would bet that you've only heard it from Todoroki's perspective and not from Endeavor's. All Might said, fists on his sides. Midoriya clenched his twitching hands into fists. So you think he was just lying or something? How bad did he think he was? He was one of his best students. Why was he doubting him like this? I wouldn't say lying. But I believe the two just have many misunderstandings that need to be talked about. And they can't talk about it if young Todoroki keeps sneaking out. And imagine how worried his father must be having not seen him in nearly a week without a word. Endeavor was never worried. He was just angry. Maybe you're trying too hard to be the hero here to the wrong person. I'll be Shudo's hero. I'll be something you could never be to him. You're too focused on your own friend. Just because some people have powerful quirks doesn't mean they're suited to be a hero. Endeavor didn't deserve to be a hero, not with what Midoriya heard over the phone that one evening. Only being able to sit at the bar, helpless to do anything while the man angrily beat his youngest son. That wasn't a hero. Well, of course. That's how villains exist. Do you think villains are just people heroes never saved? Midoriya's anger had subsided into something more quiet and sinister as his eyes became a bit darker than usual. All Might noticed it but was still willing to have this conversation. I wouldn't say that. Some just do what they do for greed. The little villain shook his head. Those are just criminals. I think villains have more complicated goals and morals than people who just steal what they want. Why were they talking about this? Where was this conversation coming from? Heroes can't save everyone, young man. Hero work isn't that easy. We would save everyone if we could. Heroes did their best. They always did their best to save people, didn't they? The freckled boy began to twitch at the corner of his lips. A crooked smile began to grow on his adorable face. Not once have you abandoned someone, All Might? Not once. His eyes had gone red as he used his thumbs to push up his smile as his eyes began to water subtly. You never left someone alone to die on purpose? Not with that big smile of yours? All Might felt some kind of chill travel through his body, his legs frozen and his smile dropping. Something felt very wrong here. This child was nowhere near the same as the one he saved from that slime villain. The boy in that interrogation room, this was him. Always saying I am here. Were you really always there for everyone? He wanted to say yes. He did his best to save everyone. He had many regrets and had made many mistakes, surely. But did he truly try his best for everyone? I did believe so. I've always done my best for everyone. These are very sensitive questions, my boy. Midoriya dropped his hands and gave his backpack a small tug as he began to walk past him. The hero's heart dropped as the boy looked back at him with glaring red eyes. You've abandoned Shudo. But I won't. Upon returning to the bar, Shigaraki was surprised to see Midoriya come through the door by himself. No Prince Charming today? He asked. He was sure Todoroki was just living there at this point. But it seemed that he was still getting dragged back home. The little villain put his bag on the floor and put his head face down on the counter. Endeavor? The other asked. He got a nod in response. You can steal him tomorrow. I want to steal him always. I'm sure there's something else you want to steal too. Midoriya's face turned bright red as he sat right up and began frantically trying to hit his older brother figure but was simply blocked by one hand every time, casually. I do not. Not. He cried, but the older villain just smirked. Denial. He's a little younger than you, right? He's probably not feeling the same things you are yet. It was a few months' difference, but Midoriya was beyond embarrassed by this conversation. Nope, shut up. He tried covering Shigaraki's mouth just to get him to stop talking. That's quite enough, Shigaraki, Kurogyari said, warping himself behind the bar. It was easy to assume that he had to leave to drop Todoroki's things and Zuzu at his house again. Sneaking in and out of the mansion was not always a quick task. Shigaraki just snickered evilly to himself as Midoriya backed off and folded his arms childishly. Both of them were children. Are we any closer to finding his brother, by the way? The little villain asked. He was soon handed a small glass of chocolate milk, the beverage of true villains. Shigaraki sighed and tilted his head limply to the side. I got his quirk, his name, and how old he is. But Jiren said no one has seen him alive since he was barely a teenager. He's at least 20 now if he's out there. People could do lots of things to change their appearances, especially when they achieve the freedoms of becoming an adult. Piercings, tattoos, and plastic surgeries were all fair game. I have to bet on the sports festival later this month. Midoriya tilted his head. What did the festival have to do with finding this missing Todoroki? Sports festival? He asked for elaboration. It's not looking great considering why we're looking for this guy. But I have to bet on him caring enough about his little brother to go watch him at the festival. There'll be at least 1,000 people there. You'll be looking for a needle in a haystack. I have to bet on him sitting as close or as far away from Endeavor as possible. But even then, it's the best I got, okay? He might not even be there. A lot of what Shigaraki was thinking about was based on chance. This guy barely had a trail, and that was probably what he wanted. The chances of him even being at the sports festival were not high. He had been away from his family for years. Would he really care enough to go see his little brother fight like a hero in a stadium? Shigaraki looked to Midoriya, who was looking down in thought. He could tell the boy was trying to think of another idea for him, but he was just as lost. But when Shigaraki was thinking of this idea, he could only think of it as being a valid plan. He wanted to watch Midoriya grow into something great and see him progress. That's what big brothers are supposed to want, right? I have a feeling he'll be there, he muttered. It wasn't long for the two to take advantage of the evening together. They continued to practice agility and dexterity in the underground training room for hours. Kurogyari stood and watched from against the elevator door. He saw Shigaraki still holding back his top speed but still not going easy on Midoriya at all. But the little villain had improved greatly since they had first started doing this. Sloppy sidestepping and frantic reactions had become more composed and fluid. There were points where Kurogyari would call for a timeout and then pull the little villain aside to give him pointers. For someone who warped everywhere, Midoriya was curious as to how he was so good at moving on his feet, though it appeared that he wasn't as agile as he used to be. He did well to explain how to perform dexterity skills, but could not show it. It made the little villain curious as to how that could be. By sundown, The dark fog man watched the little villain swerve around Shigaraki and grab his arm, tugging him back to throw him slightly off balance but still standing, and then leaping up behind him. What would be an easy kill shot to the throat with a knife was the little villain jumping up to cling to his older brother's back. He looked so happy as he hugged him, chuckling to himself. Finally, he was good enough. Shigaraki had gone back to hide in his room, but it was likely that he was planning for their big ambush soon. It left Kurogiri and Midoriya in the training room where the suited man took the time to set up a few targets and gave the little villain a few knives to throw for the sake of target practice. It didn't take a lot of energy, so it gave the boy time to cool down from agility training. "Kurogiri, are you and Tomu close?" Midoriya asked randomly. Always the curious mind. As he kept throwing knives, the other continued to retrieve and return them. "I've been taking care of him for many years now. It's been my duty to." And yet the two seemed to bicker a lot. It was like Kurogiri was doing this begrudgingly. Was that not the case? "You guys seem a bit prickly sometimes. Do you like having him here?" He didn't quite understand their relationship fully. "Shigaraki Tamura is meant to be the successor to a powerful man who's given me purpose. I was entrusted to take care of him. But I felt it was necessary to make sure that he never became emotionally attached to me. It would be a distraction to his development." That explained a lot of their tense relationship. He wondered if Shigaraki was ever jealous of Midoriya for becoming closer with Kurogiri because there was less pressure to keep a distance. But Midoriya just smirked. "Somehow, I feel you may have failed a little bit. But I wouldn't feel too bad about it." It was then that Midoriya's phone would vibrate in his pocket. He knew exactly who it was, which made him look at it instantly. It was just a text. Nothing dramatic and nothing terribly worrying. Just a simple, "I miss you" from Todoroki. He replied with an, "I miss you too," but there was no reply back. He must have gone to sleep. Midoriya stood in the usual hallway he and Todoroki would usually part ways at before going to homeroom. He checked his phone multiple times to check the time to see that the bell would ring very soon. He was becoming worried as to where he beloved her could be. Was he hurt so badly that he couldn't come to school? Was Endeavor holding him hostage at home? Todoroki was never late. He texted him a few times asking where he was, but he never received a reply, not even a read notification. The text from the night before seemed much more concerning now. What did he mean when he said he missed him? He began to pace in circles, looking down each hall in the area for him. What if he just skipped seeing him entirely? Todoroki wouldn't do that. Midoriya wanted to see him more badly than before. But he had to go to homeroom without seeing him. Todoroki was at school, but he had made it there at the last possible second. He wasn't trying to be late, but he wasn't rushing either. It was the opposite. His pace was much slower and he looked much more tired than he had in a while now. There were no bandages on him, no fresh burns or bruises. It would appear that Endeavor did not lay a finger on him the day before. But no one knows what they must have talked about, what was said to him. To keep being dragged home to be met with pain in every form only made him miserable. Being in a secret relationship was such a hassle. He only felt love from Midoriya these days, but it would appear that something was wrong with that now. Did he deserve that love? Was he being selfish by wanting it? Was he just to bother his beloved villain? Was he worth his time in the end? Sitting down in homeroom, the class was still gloomy, though conversation was becoming the norm amongst the students again. It was small talk and it was more light-hearted. No one wanted to talk about Kosuke yet. But the one who was the most okay the day before now appeared to be the least okay as he placed his cheek on his upper arm on his desktop. "Good morning, Todoroki." Yaoyorozu greeted as usual, but she knew something was wrong. But was it okay to bring it up? "Didn't sleep well, huh?" "Yeah, me neither." She couldn't see his face with him laying his head down away from her, but she noticed an empty gaze when he walked in the room. And she wasn't the only one. Ida was looking back at him, worried. Maybe it was all starting to get to him. He wanted to talk to him, but what could he say after such a tragedy? Midoriya was relieved to see Todoroki on the screen in the observation room. He was at school and without a scratch on him. But he could tell that something was a bit off. A look in his eyes was not quite right. It was similar to the one he saw the night he snuck him out of his home. But this was a more intense emptiness, and there was a lot of hurt. He just looked so sad. They were going to talk about it at lunch, without a doubt. He was going to hunt him down if he had to. The focus of today's hero training was teamwork. Allying with random heroes on the streets was inevitable, so heroes needed to know how to make combinations work even if it appeared daunting. Midoriya scoffed because of course Todoroki was paired with Ida. Just his luck. In separate grounds, students were put in pairs, except for one group of 3, to take on robots. This was also a stamina test. Which pair lasted the longest, destroying the most robots for the longest time would get the highest grade to how well their teamwork was. Those things are unfair. They discriminate people whose quirks only work on people. Shinso nearly pouted. Yamada heard and smiled. I'll talk to the faculty about that for next semester. He gave a quick thumbs up. He was proactive with feedback. That was nice. Some pairs were knocked out quicker than others due to odd matchups and insane numbers of robots that were set out to attack them. Some pairs had to fight more than 10 at a time. These things were not small either, as they ranged from being the size of cars to the size of buildings. Groups that included Bakugo and Jiru, Ashido and Mineta, and Todoroki and Ida, would eventually rack up scores to 50 where they were faced with a robot the size of a skyscraper to prove that they were strong enough and had enough energy to proceed further. Jiru would angle her speakers towards the massive thing to try and stun in, even for a short moment, so Bakugo could get close and release a powerful blast from his gauntlets. What looked like a successful hit caused Bakugo's arm to throb and tense up from pain and overuse when he landed on the ground. But when he looked back up at the robot, there was only a dent. These things weren't flimsy. Mineta's head was beginning to bleed due to the number of balls he had thrown to immobilize the robots, and when he saw the big one, he fainted from fear alone, leaving Ashido with dead weight and only her acid to try and take it down. But the metal was too thick to burn quickly, and they were captured by its hand before they could even try to defeat it. Todoroki still chose to only use ice in his hero work training. To him, these robots were but straw dummies that weren't worth his breath. Ida watched him barely even move his feet or arms while freezing the metal beasts to the point that their metal limbs would crack and break off from the temperature alone. Others received blasts that would stab straight through them. Ida did help in destroying a few with his legs, but he was very limited in what he could do with a close-range quirk. He wouldn't let himself become dead weight. But Todoroki was the one pulling the team, though there was not much teamwork involved in their strategy. Todoroki, Ida, you both are just fighting without communicating. You need to show some coordination if you want a perfect score. Aizawa told them through an earpiece that every student was asked to wear. It was a means of Aizawa and All Might giving pointers during practice without being by their sides. Right? Ida affirmed. But Todoroki was silent for a few moments as he stopped moving. Sorry, he mumbled. There was no confidence. There was no passion to fight. What was he even doing? Have some spirit, young man. You're still doing great. All Might added, hearing his dead tone. Perhaps he just needed a little praise. But somehow, it just made him feel worse. Yeah, something was very wrong with him. When the massive beast of a robot was sent out, Ida was quick to notice something about it. There's a weak point on the back of its neck. Can you protect me and get me up there with your ice, Todoroki? He asked, trying to scrounge any points of teamwork that he could. He got a silent nod as an answer, which was the best he was going to get. A ramp of ice was made for him to shoot up into the air. The half-and-half boy then made a giant wave of ice to try and immobilize the robot, only for it to heat itself up and begin to melt it. So he did it again and made it branch out to other buildings so Ida could leap onto paths he was making paths of ice while making walls to defend him from rockets and rubber bullets. There was so much precision and speed that was required to do all of this, it was beyond impressive for a teenager. Ida was sent in a circle so the robot couldn't keep up with him, and by the time he got close to its neck, it didn't have time to defend itself. One solid kick to its weak spot caused the head of it to explode into smoke. That was perfect. You're amazing, Todoroki. He cheered as he slid down a slide of ice back down to the ground. Todoroki? Defeating such an obstacle should be celebrated and congratulated. Ida was heaving for breath with an accomplished smile on his face while also covered in sweat from all his intense running and leaping. He bet Todoroki didn't even have adrenaline going through all of this. He expected to him being cool and collected as usual. Maybe he would even be impressed with their teamwork. However, he only saw him looking straight up at the robot he defeated as his ice holding it in place was still melting. Pieces of metal had begun to fall from it and leave craters in the pavement from the height they were falling at. It would be safe to back up. But he was standing so close. There was a loud creak from its body as it began to lean forward. It was going to fall. And Todoroki was just here, staring up at it. Todoroki? Ida asked again, a little louder. Why wasn't he moving? It wasn't frozen. But it took one look at his facial expression to get a terrible impression. Todoroki, what are you doing? Ida shouted. Midoriya dropped his school notebook and began frantically scratching at his wrists, watching the screen and hearing Ida shout through his headset. No, Shuto, what's wrong? He had to move. He was going to get crushed. The little villain wanted to scream so he would hear his voice, but that was impossible. I'm so tired. Todoroki's voice was so soft in the mic. Midoriya turned the volume up on his headset to hear him. I'm just tired of it. So many people were watching him. And everyone that could hear him knew exactly what he was thinking about. Ida, get him out of there. Aizawa shouted over the line. There was panic in his tone. Ida didn't waste a moment to charge up what fuel remained in his legs to send himself running straight at Todoroki, grabbing him by his torso and taking him out of the impact of the robot's fall. They fell as a dust cloud blew over them harshly from the robot's landing. Ida rose to his hands and knees over Todoroki, looking down at him and being taken aback by how lost and miserable he appeared. But it wouldn't stop him from lecturing him. What the hell was that? You could have gotten killed, he yelled. He was only met with silence and an unblinking face. Do you understand that? You could have died. Midoriya listened and was shaking with emotions. Don't yell at him. He doesn't like getting yelled at. He's just sad. Get off of him. You're making him feel cornered. What do you have to say for yourself? Do you think we want to have another classmate die? Don't guilt him into living. He has to want to live. Someone like you can never understand that. No. Todoroki finally responded quietly but turned his head away. He wanted nothing more than to just disappear from this whole situation. But Ida was not going to let that happen as he knelt over him and pushed his cheek to make him face him harshly. It almost came off as a slap. I know this is hard for all of us. But you can't just go do something like that. He wanted him to shut up so badly. He wanted to get away and just go somewhere quiet. Everything felt too loud, his gear felt too heavy. Everything was too bright. I know, surely he knew better than this. But why was he acting this way? It wasn't like him at all. Then why? Don't you understand what was at risk just now? Doesn't that matter? Ida looked so desperate and distraught, even tearing up from under his glasses. He was full of overwhelming emotions and felt so free to express them. It must have been nice. We'll call it a day. Come back to the screening room, everyone. Aizawa instructed over the line. Bakugo and Gyre were stuck in a stalemate against the robot. Ashido and Mineta lost, and Todoroki and Ida were not trusted enough to continue the training exercise. It was pointless and unsafe to continue. Ida slowly got off of Todoroki and tried to offer him a hand to get up. His gesture was denied and Todoroki stood up in silence, walking away at a more delayed step. The speedy hero tried to grab his shoulder. Todoro dashed, but his hand was gently but sternly slapped away without a word. Ice was lightly frosted over Todoroki's shoulder and back subtly. And upon returning to the training area's lobby, he unstrapped the yellow heater harness and threw it against the wall in a sudden motion, making Ida jump. What are you doing, Dash? He retrieved the heater and watched the half-and-half boy make a run towards the wrong direction from the screening room everyone was waiting in. He meant to charge up his legs, but it only made them throb in soreness from their training. He was forced to chase after him at a regular human speed. Watching his classmate turn the corner, he did the same and saw him run into a bathroom that happened to be in that hall. As he was about to follow him inside, someone shoved him away with all their tiny strength. Stay away from him. He doesn't want you. Midoriya snapped at him. The little freckled villain had bolted out of the observation room without objection from Yamada. He knew where Class 1A was gathered. He knew how they entered and exited the training grounds. He knew every hall, every corner, every vent, every quiet spot. Ida was stunned by the shove and looked down at the smaller boy in shock. Midoriya only glared for a few moments and debated on yelling at him more, but turned the other cheek and ran into the bathroom after Todoroki. His first priority. One of the lights above a stall had been broken with ice sheeting the ceiling, causing the room to become dimmer, but not pitch black. Shudo! Midoriya called out upon entering, letting Todoroki recognize his voice before getting closer. The ice covering the ceiling had a trail leading from a section of the wall that helped the boy find which stall his beloved hero was hiding in. Sitting on the floor with his face in his upper arms, hands gripping the back of his shirt, Todoroki sat in silence and was unmoving. The little villain rushed to him. Shochan, it's me. He had never called him by a nickname before. It just kind of came out. He got on his knees and placed his hands on his beloved's shoulders. Shochan, what happened? What's wrong? Talk to me, please, he cried, shaking him. It was then he swore he heard the bathroom door open, but he chose to ignore it. The most important thing to him was right in front of him. Midoriya slowly took his hands back and just sat on his knees, taking a deep breath. A long inhale to calm himself, and an exhale to release his own stress, his wrists stinging. But that wasn't important. He just looked at him. His hero was so broken in this moment. It hurt to see him like this. And yet he understood what he was feeling, even if he didn't understand the cause. He looked up at the broken light. He noticed the topmost buttons of his white costume were undone. His heater was missing. He wasn't speaking. He'd become overstimulated with oversensory. It was best not to touch him. You don't like it when people yell at you, yeah? He kept his voice quiet. He kept his hands on his own knees, in a polite fashion. I know you too well. You hide it, but you get anxious sometimes. Not like me, I'm not that good at being secret. He smiled cutely even though he knew the other couldn't see it. But he could hear it in his tone. When you get like that, you usually don't like to be touched, except by me for whatever reason. I wonder why that is, he hummed. But he still knew his place, keeping his hands to himself. I knew something was wrong the second I saw you spacing out. You disassociate when you're upset. Or when you're bored. It's cute when you're bored. I wish I saw you this morning. We could have talked about it. They could talk about it now, but he wasn't going to bother him with it. But it was soon that his tone dropped. He sounded sad, choked up even. Something happened last night. When you texted me. I never should have let go. I messed up, just like last time. And now you're hurt again. It was All Might's fault. He let Endeavor take him away. He let him get hurt. But who was he kidding? Todoroki was always hurting. This wasn't anything new. It was just showing. Midoriya began to tear up thinking about it. You're always in so much pain, you're so tired. I get it. It's just exhausting having every day be a fight to just be content. Not even happy. Just content. Midoriya took his chance to slowly wrap his arms around Todoroki's head and shoulders, beginning to pet his hair. Just how he liked. You don't have to tell me anything. You can take a break. It's all right. He rested his teary cheek on the top of his head. He didn't mind that he wasn't getting any responses. Sometimes the talking just needed to wait. Thankfully, he didn't have to wait too long. You're not mad? Todoroki asked quietly. Never. Is this inconvenient? Never. Am I weak now? Never. Endeavor did not leave a scratch on him for this day. The injuries he left the little doctor to tend to this time could not be healed with bandages. These wounds were not as easily seen. It was cruel. What could he have possibly said to Todoroki to bring him to this? Midoriya felt Todoroki's hands make their way to his back to bring him closer, finally being ready to be touched and the anxiety slowly passing. I want to go to bed. He was tired. He was just tired. You can take a nap at lunch again. I'll wake you up. Midoriya hummed, bringing his tone up again for him. He felt his beloved hero's hug tighten. Thank you, Todoroki whispered. They would remain like this for at least a few minutes. But school was school and they were ditching class and they had to return. They left the bathroom together and saw that Ida was nowhere to be found. Todoroki's heater was just outside the door for him to pick up and put back on. Before they parted ways, Midoriya was sure to reach up to his cheek and kiss his lips softly with his eyes closed. Don't tell them anything you don't want to. He pulled back with that beautiful minty glow in his eyes and the most innocent smile. You only need me. They won't understand you like I do. I'm here for you always. His last words before returning to his general studies course. A reminder for Todoroki to keep up his walls against the heroes. And when Todoroki returned to class, he received worried and estranged looks from all his classmates. He hated the staring, but he ignored it. Ida was the first to look away. It would have made sense for Aizawa to lecture Todoroki in front of everyone, and yet all he did was hand him a piece of paper with critiques and pointers, and a passing grade on it. However, there was a small note at the bottom of it that was circled. See me after school, how embarrassing. Todoroki, what happened back there? Todoroki, man, what's up? We were all hecka worried about you. A class full of to-be heroes, of course they cared. Yaoyorozu was the first to catch up with him in the hallway to lunch period. She was soon followed by Kirishima and Kaminari. Todoroki acknowledged all of them with soft glances but only with silence. There's nothing wrong with talking about it. You can tell us. We get it, you know? Kirishima seemed a bit more persistent. He had recovered well after the tragedy. He looked terrible during the incident, and not that much better at the police station. He seemed even a bit stronger now. But even with all these kind people reaching out to him, there was only one hand he trusted enough to hold. He turned away from them and picked up his walking pace. Hey Yaoyorozu was going to try to catch up when an arm was stretched in front of her. It was Ida. He appeared to be very upset but tried to keep a straight face. He just needs space. The three of them looked to their class president. Was that really what he needed? A half-eaten bowl of rice sat next to Midoriya's legs as he continued to eat ramen from his own bowl with his hero sleeping on his legs. He was petting his hair like he would any other time, occasionally wiping away tears from his cheeks when he noticed them. This was their peaceful place. Just for them. Only them. Even if they weren't communicating, Midoriya felt a bit more ease coming from his beloved like this. Sometimes a snack and a nap were all one needed to calm down a bit. This was all fine. At least until he heard footsteps. Students are instructed to eat in the cafeteria with everyone else. You two shouldn't be out here. Such a nagging voice. Midoriya was sure to cover Todoroki's ears to let him keep resting. Ida stood before them with his arms folded, still trying to keep a strong outward appearance as a class president and diligent student. Shudo doesn't like the noise. We're staying out here, the little villain growled back, a bit of red making itself known in his eyes. He was on the defensive here. This time he would protect Todoroki. After what happened, it's best for Shudo wants nothing to do with you or anyone in your hero class. Can't you see that? Or is your head too far up your ass in pride? Stop pretending that you want us to follow the rules when you really just want him for yourself. Ida was just using the rules as a means of forcing Todoroki back with everyone. He was trying to take him away too. Midoriya wasn't going to let him get taken away. Never again. He let Ida stand there in shock at such inappropriate words before he saw his folded arms drop to his side and his head hung low. That's not, the freckled boy raised a brow. What? Did you wuss out last second and came out here lecture us instead of something else? Such a snappy brat. But he was right. I did want to apologize. Ida got down on his knees before them with his hands balled into fists on his lap. I overheard you talking to him. I had no idea about anything. He had been ignorant of anything that upset Todoroki. The yelling, pinning him down, nearly slapping his face, and chasing him, he didn't know that it would upset his classmates so much. He gritted his teeth in frustration with himself. I had no idea I upset him so much. I came here hoping he would have it in his heart to forgive me. His big heart. His beautiful heart. Midoriya merely scoffed as he looked down at his beloved still blissfully sleeping. He was nearly curled in a ball with his hand lightly clenched into a fist near his mouth. The villain wiped away one of his tears that had begun to stray away from his resting eyes. Knowing him, he will. He's much kinder than I am, you know? How he would love to kill Ida like he did Kosuka. Worse. Keep him alive longer. Make his suffering more rigid and cruel. bragged to him how Todoroki would never be his to hold, to kiss, to love. But he's busy right now, so you might as well get lost. Ida appeared to be offended now. This boy was so terribly rude. He was protective, but his tongue was sharp and mean. You might as well never talk to him again. You're only going to hurt him more. All you do is nag and he hates that more than anything. Forgive me, but I think this kind of talk from you is unwarranted. I only have good intentions, I swear to you. He's too good for some kiss-up like you. Some guy like you would never understand him. This is unreasonable. You can't just keep him to yourself. You're blocking people out like this, that's abusive. Something snapped. Say that again and you may just end up like Kosuke, Midoriya growled darkly, his head lowered but eyes glaring up at Ida, Todoroki still having his ears covered. Ida sat up a bit straighter as a drop of sweat dripped down the side of his head. The air had become so heavy all of a sudden. The air felt cold and yet it stung. Is that a threat? Ida questioned, narrowing his eyes back. Midoriya would not tolerate being called such a thing. He wasn't like Endeavor. He would never be anything like him. Ida was wrong. He was wrong. The two students would have their tension interrupted by a small sound. Very quiet, but loud enough to break the silence between them. A sound of subtle distress. Todoroki's face had become a bit stressed as his hand began clutching repeatedly at nothing. Shoten, I'm here. It's me here, see? Midoriya suddenly softly smiled and cooed as he gave his hero his hand and watched another tear fall. Ida noticed the crying and his heart broke witnessing it. Had he caused that? Such an intense sadness. He always cries when he sleeps. But you don't know why that is, do you? The little villain sneered bitterly. So why don't you mind your own business? This conversation was going nowhere. In front of Ida was an overprotective boy providing comfort for someone he loved. But all he saw was a snake wrapping its way around Todoroki's neck and wrists, controlling who he spoke to and who to hold on to. There was nothing he could do for someone who didn't want his help. If earlier was any indication of who his classmate preferred, of course it was the one with the silver tongue. Before their talk went on any further, the jet-legged student saw no other proper option than to just walk away and leave them be. Though he did look back to see Todoroki awaken and reach up, almost playfully, to touch Midoriya's cheeks and sleepily poke at his freckles. How could he be so comfortable with someone like that? Do you feel safe with Midoriya Izuku? Yes. Do you feel safe living with him? Yes. Are you being properly taken care of at his home? Yes. Have you ever felt unsafe or threatened in his care? No. The day had ended and Aizawa stood in front of the door, blocking Todoroki's only exit. All the other students had left, leaving just the two of them behind. The boy was giving quick answers, short and simple answers, trying to get out of school as quickly as possible. His teacher was trying so hard to understand. He was determined to obtain the truth. Was it a fight with Midoriya that led to your stunt this afternoon? No. Was it Endeavor? No. There was hesitation. What was it then? The tragedy. Endeavor called it survivor's guilt. Liar. It was so obviously a lie. You went home with Endeavor last night, did you not? I did. And you were with Midoriya during the grieving period? I was. Aizawa did not trust Midoriya in the slightest. But the difference in personality that Todoroki portrayed compared to the first day back to the second was more than significant. Neither person in his student's life was safe. But at least he was happier with the estranged freckled boy. Are you staying with Midoriya tonight? Todoroki nodded in confirmation. No wonder he was so eager to leave, he had been eyeing the exit the whole time. Aizawa couldn't help but sigh as he got out of the way of the door. Next time you feel like pulling that again, talk to me beforehand, got it? He grumbled. He sounded annoyed, but anyone could tell that he was far from it. Out of all his students, this one had the most concerning future. Understood. Todoroki went out the door without looking back in a light run, hurrying but not sprinting. He didn't say a proper goodbye. He was ill-mannered. But in a teenage way. Todoroki met Midoriya at the front gate, letting the little villain take his hand. The freckled boy smiled brightly as he cheerfully began to walk with him. You have a big training session coming up in a few days, don't you? At some building called the USJ, he asked, starting the conversation. His beloved hero nodded. "Yeah, how did you know?" he asked back. Midoriya just giggled and scratched his cheek with his index finger. Mr. Yamada asked if any volunteers were willing to play a damsel in distress. Obviously everyone said no. And those days passed. Midoriya worked hard with Shigaraki's agility training and Kurogiri's knife-throwing sessions to improve his ability to defend himself. His blood was hot with excitement, anticipation. What a glorious sight it would be to see his precious Nomu beat down the #1 hero, the #1 phony. Would his big brother finish the job, or would he get the honors? If he were to be given that chance, would he slit his throat, or go straight for the heart? Maybe cut out his tongue first just to get him to shut up for a few seconds. Every day he awaited the results of Shigaraki's marvelous plan. The older villain had been working almost every time Midoriya saw him. He never quite understood what he was doing until he showed him the screen of his laptop at the bar one night. Hundreds of pictures of criminals he had accumulated to join him in his ambush. He was using sheer numbers to distract anyone that would try to help All Might. The Nomu needed to battle without interference for a guaranteed victory. All this time Shigaraki had been bribing and blackmailing and convincing people to join his side for this one attack. An early dawn awaited that day. Before his school alarm went off, before the sun had even risen, Midoriya was grinning ear to ear, buttoning up his new outfit, tying his tie like Kurogiri had taught him, lacing his shoes, and inspecting his metal mouth mask and white face mask. The day he could officially wear this for the world to see. He mentally apologized to Todoroki. But he would be sure to keep him out of serious danger. Kurogiri would warp him in and his classmates as far away from the Nomu danger zone as possible. Anyone that got close would just be warped again. It was a shame that his hero liked his class despite not being close to any of them except Ida. He would never join them if anyone died, except for maybe one person. If Ida thought he was getting off easy with pinning Todoroki to the ground and screaming at him, he was unmistakably wrong. He looked in the mirror and fixed his tie neatly to the center and placed his metal mouth mask on his face. "The one you let fall is going to shoot you down, All Might," he mumbled with a voice much deeper and skewed than his own. It was to disguise him. It was then that he heard his bedroom door open and saw Shigaraki in the reflection of his mirror, leaning back against the door covered in about a dozen hands strung together with red rope-like material. He wore his precious father on his face. Were they all real? "Come down. Someone's here to see you and bring your school uniform," he said almost coldly before smirk could just barely be seen under his father's palm. "That doesn't look too bad on you. Well, you two really do mean business." Waiting for them sitting on a bar stool with a shot glass in hand was a very familiar face. Blonde hair and stitches on his forehead, a cigarette resting on an ashtray beside him, and a casual smile on his lips. He didn't look as panicked as before, and he wasn't switching between personalities either. He must have felt calmed here. "Bye-bye Gawarajin. Villain, twice." The last the man had seen the Villainous brothers, they were just out in the city together in casual clothing. But here they were, covered in severed hands and wearing a metal mouth that had razor-sharp triangular teeth. Midoriya lowered his mouthpiece and raised a brow. Why? He was about to ask when he felt a hand, minus a pinky, rest on his head. "If you call out sick from school today, that's gonna make you look really bad. Especially with how Eraserhead, All Might, and Endeavor are not fans of you." Shigaraki answered. Midoriya had told him and Kurogiri during his training nights about what had been happening during the day. There was nothing to keep secret here anymore. Twice stood up and whipped out a roll of measuring tape from his back pocket as he began snappily measuring the freckled boy up. Midoriya froze up and tensed at the fabric being wrapped around his limbs, neck, head, and torso all of a sudden. It felt awkward and Shigaraki chuckling at him did not help as he began to blush. When he was backed away from, the little villain began weakly slapping the older one for making fun of him. And it was when he stopped that he noticed that there was now an extra person in the room. It was him. Another him. It was a perfect replica, smirking at him. He tilted his head at the clone curiously, and it mirrored him teasingly. "That's really weird." He reached out to touch it and it reached back and held his hand with a smile. "I'll take good care of Shochan, I promise," it said happily. Midoriya's face went bright red. How did it know? My clones can last a few hours without damage. But they're pretty fragile. One hit and it melts away depending on the stature of the original. And if they're out and about for too long, they'll start acting a little funny. Twice explained. Funny how? How long is too long? Midoriya asked, circling his clone curiously. It just stood there with its arms folded, looking proud of having such attention. A school day should be its limit during this case. But Boss Man here told me that it will only have to last half that. And by funny, they get a bit twitchy and having a bit too much fun causing trouble. So they start acting more like twice other personality. It felt almost rude to let Todoroki leave with a clone. Midoriya was sure to only give it one command before letting it go to his hero's living space. Don't you dare kiss him? To which his clone groaned and whined. But that's not fair. But I guess it huffed. Midoriya handed it his school uniform to change into and would let it go about its day with his boyfriend. Was it bad that he felt a bit of jealousy towards it? He trusted it to not say anything stupid to anyone, but would it have any less self-control than he did? Around Todoroki in particular? He didn't want to think about it. It was too humiliating. Being warped to you once again, Todoroki walked inside oblivious to the fake that was walking in with him, holding his hand with a big smile. Instead of a kiss goodbye when parting ways, it jumped up to hug his neck tightly. Have a good day, Shochan. We can have lunch under the tree again today, it assured, letting go and landing playfully on its feet. Todoroki was not one to express too much emotion, but he did appear curious by the cheerfulness of the clone. Izuku, why did you start calling me Shochan all of a sudden? He asked. The clone stuck its tongue out with a wink. I'll tell you later, it hummed before taking hold of its backpack and giving it a good tug and running off. He was acting way cuter than normal. Todoroki wasn't complaining. Sitting in homeroom, Yaoyorozu was relieved to see him much more aware and active even though it had been a few days. But this morning felt brighter. Good morning, Todoroki. How are you feeling? She asked politely and casually like she would any other day. I'm doing well, he answered honestly. It made her smile gleefully. That's wonderful. Oh, and did you hear about a tea shop that opened around the corner this week? A casual conversation ensued. He seemed back to his usual self after just a few days. He still didn't talk much, but he was still a good listener, nodding in understanding and occasionally making small comments. Ida looked back at the two, appearing guilty still. He had not spoken to him since that day. They had not been paired up together in any training. He never attempted to apologize to him again. Haunting red eyes tormented him with cruel words continuously in his head. He would never know Todoroki enough to understand him. He couldn't give him what Midoriya could. He wasn't needed. He could only wonder if his classmate was mad at him. Normal academics would take place in the morning as they always had. The clone was diligent in its note-taking and also interacted with Shinso a few times throughout its time in the classroom. Shinso had come up with a list of students between Class 1A and acquaintances of Kosuka. He may not be social or popular, but the tired boy was also a very good listener when it came to school gossip. The clone was sure to write down what was spoken about in between academic notes. Midoriya would want to know what had been discussed so he wouldn't gain suspicion. Are they there yet? Midoriya was impatiently tapping his foot in the bar, hugging on the Nomu's neck as it sat completely still in the bar, hunched over so it wouldn't hit the ceiling. Twice had left the bar by now. Kurogiri said they're on the bus. Chill out? Shigaraki sighed, checking his phone. Oh yeah, get your ass over here. He gestured for his little brother to come closer as then leaned over the counter to dig for something underneath it. And hold your breath. Midoriya raised a brow before suddenly shutting his eyes and felt something be sprayed at him. Specifically in his hair. It smelt awful. Shigaraki began ruffling his hair up messily, and when the spraying stopped, the little villain took a peek at a few strands of his hair from the corner of his eye. It was black. It'll come out with a good wash. But we can't take any risks of you being found out yet. If there was even the slightest chance of this all failing, all this preparation being for nothing, it would be a disaster if his little spy was discovered. Especially with Todoroki not being on their side yet. It was something Shigaraki didn't want to think about, but something he had to consider. Master would be very upset if this failed, and suddenly he felt his phone go off again. They're there. You will all be taken to the different zones to practice different search and rescue efforts. Not every disaster is the same, and some of you are more efficient in some areas than others. You all must practice teamwork and adapting to these different environments. Pro Hero 13 stood before Class 1A, giving them the rundown of how their training was supposed to go for the day. They seemed enthusiastic to be given their attention for the day, eager to get their eyes set on honorable futures of being heroes. Aizawa nodded and lowered his chin into his scarf. I will separate you all into groups. Remember, when you're doing this, this shouldn't be treated as practice. Treat it like the real thing. There would be no leisure or joking around with this kind of work. Many of the students looked eager to begin, smirking and smiling, ready to challenge themselves. Then let's get dash. Hagakure was about to cheer out when something dark appeared just down the hill from where they stood. Noticing the students' attention being taken away, both 13 and Aizawa turned around to see a black foggy mass in the short distance. That's not mine, 13 muttered before more portals began to appear. Aizawa's eyes widened slightly as he began to slowly raise his arms to his sides, keeping his students back. Is this part of the training? Shoji asked with a tone that hinted that he already knew it wasn't. They all knew it wasn't. Not when scary-looking criminals and villains started emerging from the dark fog. What is that? Gyro asked, watching dozens of dangerous people just walking into building uninvited. How they got in the first time, Aizawa growled. He watched one of the portals expand and saw Shigaraki come out first with the massive Noma behind him. And sitting on top of its shoulder was the little villain that had been causing their paranoia all this time. They were here.